Hello, good morning, and welcome to Newsfile. This is your most authoritative news analysis platform, and here on Newsfile, as we know, we put Ghana first. I'm your host, Samson Ladi Anyenini. And this morning, the nominee for Office of Special Prosecutor, Kisi Ejabeng, he's NPP. How? And how does that disqualify him from being special prosecutor? He's too young. What do we mean? He's more than 40. The Constitution says you can be president at 40. So why is that a disqualification? He's a surrogate of the sponsors of the Ejapa deal. Where is the evidence? Sir Sam Jonah, what has he said that is new? But is it true that there's a culture of silence, making media unable to be critical, academia, civil society quiet, and for which reason there is bad governance? The broadcasting bill. What is the fear? Are we afraid that it will get us to a point where one must say, Oga, please, Oga, I beg, I go fit talk small about this matter? Is that our fear? How genuine is it? We're right back to deal with the vexed matters. You're welcome back. This is Newsfile. It's your most authoritative news analysis platform, and here on Newsfile we put Ghana first. And here to Samson's stake. 110,000 teenagers, girls, got pregnant 2020. I have been sad, confused, and angry. Sad that girls 10 to 14 years have or will bear the troubles of pregnancy, labor, and child care. I'm confused, asking just how these children got pregnant. I'm angry because they would not have been impregnated by children, but grown men, mostly. I'm sad, thinking they would and may never return to school. School that is free to empower them for a better future. I'm confused, asking what parents and guardians could have done to prevent this. I'm angry, thinking society has failed these children. I'm sad, confused, and angry, knowing the near 110,000 teenagers, girls, who got pregnant in 2020 may not be the full picture, as these are only those that were reported to the hospital or hospitals where the Ghana Health Services data collection could get this data. I am sad, confused, and angry that only the Finder newspaper seems to have found this newsworthy. Almost 18,000 of these girls are from the Ashanti region, about 11,000 from Eastern, followed by Central region, with Accra and Northern accounting for a little over 9,000 each. Guess what? This is actually 11.7% decline from the previous year's record. What happened to our law that the age for consent to sexual intercourse is from 16 years? And having sex with a girl below 16 years, even with her consent or lack of knowledge of her age, is crime. Crime of defilement, punished by 7 to 25 years imprisonment. International law and ours stress the welfare or best interest of the child principle at all times ought to be upheld. Who is ensuring this? Parents, schools, churches, or mosques? How long can we watch almost unconcerned and find it almost normal for almost 3,000 girls between the ages of 10 and 14 to be violated and be saddled with being mothers? Ghana, almost 200,000 or more of your teenage girls cannot be subjected to this each year. Where is moral society? Do you think Sir Sam Jonah was wrong about us? When the media will troop to provide national coverage for a fraud and charlatan, Agrada, or give live coverage to a so-called celebrity who gets punished for admitting to abusing her child? How many of these girls were so terribly influenced by so-called celebrities without manners to think they needed an expensive phone to take and display not half but near full naked bodies on social media? And some adults took advantage of that, promising to give them a phone. Assuming half, 50,000 of these girls are below age 16. So are we saying we have even 10,000 of the men who violated them facing the law or in jail? The few that may have been reported to police, did some parent, elder, pastor, imam, so-called big man in the city intervene to plead for the matter to be settled at home? Has a wife not lost her marriage for insisting on the law taking its course? How many police officers or lawyers try to frustrate the process? And how many media guys didn't take money from a big man child violator to kill the story? Was some judge too compromised? And that celebrity, she got such a lenient sentence, which is now punished only by custodial sentence of, in certain circumstances, more than 20 years. Who gets such media attention for mere bail? Mere bail. We got to wake up, moral society. That's my take. I'll return shortly to introduce my guest to you, and then we go into the matters that we have to discuss this morning. In the meantime, very important notice for your attention that there's serious traffic congestion from the motorway roundabout all the way to Central University. So we humbly ask motorists to be extra careful, and the MTTD of the Ghana Police Service to go and assist the situation. We're told it's just unbearable. This show is brought to you by Bank of Africa, strong as a group and close as a partner. MTN, everywhere you go. Ashesi University, educating ethical and entrepreneurial leaders for Africa. Waylead Properties, home is where one starts from. Having mosquito spray and coil, pleasant on humans, tough nightmare on insects. And Napa Foods, it's tasty. DBS Industries, we are your roof experts. Robert & Sons Limited Optical Services, your comprehensive eye care services provider. We'll be right back. This is Newsfile. You're welcome back. This is Newsfile. It's your most authoritative news analysis platform, and here on Newsfile, as we always do, we put Ghana first. Thank you for keeping your dials here and also watching us on your JoyNews channel and DSTV channels 2421 and GoTV 144. Now, let me introduce you to my guest, and here in the studio, Al-Hassan Suhini, who is the Honorable MP for Tamale North and Member Appointments Committee of Parliament. Joseph Dindiok Pemka is former Deputy Attorney General and Minister for Justice. Joining us on Zoom are Oliver Baka Vomawo, who is researcher, University of Cambridge, Faculty of Law, and Suleimana Brahima, who is Executive Director, Media Foundation for West Africa. Gentlemen joining us via Zoom, good morning and welcome to Newsfile.
Good morning, Samson. Good to be back again.
Thank you. And good morning to you.
Good morning, Samson.
Great. All right, so we start with the very first issue, and I'd like you to listen to Haruna Idrisu, the majority leader, and Inusa Fuseni, minority leader.
Compared to Martin Amidu, he's a non-starter. Compared to Martin Amidu in terms of stature, experience, integrity, and reputation, he just doesn't come close. You need men of wits and will to fight corruption. Martin Amidu suited perfectly into it, but because he would not get the cooperation and support of the president, he had to bow out. Look at how they shamelessly got the Auditor General out of office. In one breath, you don't want people who shine their eyes on malfeasance, misappropriation, embezzlement, and corruption. So, disappointing appointment, but let's see what he's able to do. And corruption is real in Ghanaian public life. It's permeated the moral fabric of our public service. Sometimes we narrow it only to political office holders or to politicians of ministers and MPs, but you need to open your eye for it to be more inclusive.
Does it mean if any politician in Ghana says, I'm going to fight corruption, Ghanaians will not take it serious because of what you've really enumerated? This was a campaign.
After Martin Hamidu, I mean, he's a person with unquestionable integrity. And his integrity, you would not find many that can stand up to the moral standing of Martin Amidu. He's been Attorney General. He declined appointment to the Supreme Court, Special Prosecutor. In any case, what is before the courts? How many cases? Are you monitoring them? What has been investigated? I just think that Nana Danko have lost the fight against corruption, and he's presiding over probably what will become in history as the West twin crisis: economic crisis, energy crisis, and a COVID public health.
As a lawyer, former MP, my only concern in the age, certainly a year special prosecutor bill, you may to coin, we call Canada, or we call South Africa, maybe a dynamic kind.
My concern as a lawyer and former MP is his age. When we're working on the law setting up the office, we traveled. Some went to Canada, some went to South Africa, and I was part of the group that went to Singapore. In all these places, the special prosecutor was either the same age as the president or older than the president.
There must be some kind of respect, mutual respect between the president and the special prosecutor. Yes, because the special prosecutor will have to perform his duties without fear nor favor. Corruption and corruption-related offences, breaches of the Procurement Act, no overfight it. And it can go both ways. It can be against the government, it can be against the other members of the public. So,
if the person is young, and in this case of Ajibin, he's just about 43 years, the problem is if the age difference won't lead to the president trying to control him.
The problem is the age difference between one and the president, and will it manifest in the president trying to control him? Because ultimately president, it can be a child of the president. So that is.
Right, so you heard Haruna Idrisu, the minority leader, and Inusa Fuseni, who is a former minister and a former member of parliament. Let's get to look at this issue now. So as we played the sounds to you, if you're watching us on television, you would have seen Kessie Jabin's profile that was displayed. Impressive, but what's the problem now? So let me begin with Suleimana of the Media Foundation for West Africa. I don't want the lawyers here in the studio, the lawyer here in the studio to begin and perhaps begin on a legal note that may, or your colleague lawyer on Zoom to begin on a legal note that may influence your thoughts. So let's hear you. And I don't also want the MP to talk before you do. So let's hear you. What do you say about what is being said?
Well, Samson, thank you very much. I think that the office of the special prosecutor is a very unique and an important office. And in trying to assess who qualifies to occupy that office beyond what is stated in the Act 959/2017 or in our Constitution, I think it is important to look at what is even the basis or the rationale for the establishment of the office. What are some of the demands of the occupant of the office, the burden that the occupant of the office carries. And with that, then you can look at whether or not, beyond the paper qualifications and the work that the person may have done in one way or the other, the person really merits that position. Now, if you look at the rationale that was provided in the 2016 manifesto of the NPP, in terms of promising to fight corruption, it makes it clear that one of the challenges was the fact that the Attorney General literally has a monopoly of prosecutorial powers. And if you take Shraj or Iyoko, for example, they require the permission of the Attorney General to go to court on matters of corruption or corruption-related offenses. And the other point they raised was that the Attorney General and Minister of Justice is also an appointee of the President, serves at the pleasure of the President, and can be fired at any time by the President or reshuffled by the President. And therefore, it is important to have an independent office occupied by an independent individual to deal with the matters of corruption and corruption-related offenses. Now, I think that in itself sets a tone that one can say, well, if you are a president and you are truly and honestly committed to the fight against corruption, and you know that one of the problems or one of the major hindrances is the fact that you appoint somebody as your Attorney General, and because that person works under you, and can be controlled by you and can be fired by you, the person may lack some independence. Then if you have that commitment and, the moral suasion to say, I would fight corruption, the fundamental question to ask is, would you even need an office of special prosecutor? So if I appoint you and I say, look, do as the law says, I wouldn't interfere, and I want you to prosecute all matters of corruption or corruption-related offenses. So I think that is number one. So to the extent that the MPP then admitted that because our leader, our president would appoint the attorney general, and therefore there is that monopoly of prosecutorial powers and so on and so forth. We need someone to occupy a certain office called Office of the Special Prosecutor. I think it then goes beyond just appointing persons who qualify by dint of their, academic qualifications or, experience in practicing law and the years that they have had in the bar. And the other question you ask is, if the Attorney General can be controlled or can be fired and works at the pleasure of the president, then would you really need someone who, for example, indirectly, because we do know, for example, by law, the AG is supposed to nominate the person, the president will have to accept and then transmit it to Parliament to get approval, and then the president would appoint. But the reality we know is that there is no way the AG would have done the nomination without consulting the president. I don't think that if President Akufo-Addo was not comfortable with Kissie Jabin, AG, Attorney General Godfrey Dame would have done that. And so I am looking beyond. I think that those talking about age, I don't believe is a critical issue. As someone said, even the president could have been 40. I mean, we had Obama, who was, not in the categories of persons you describe as very old, leading the most powerful country and serving as the commander-in-chief of the most powerful armed forces or army in the world. So I think that, for me, is not an issue. If you look at the credentials in terms of Kissie's qualification, masters in law, was called to the bar in 2003. And so the 12-year threshold that the Act provides, he certainly qualifies. I think what is critical is to look at, as perhaps Haruna said, in terms of stature, in terms of reputation, in terms of strength of character. Is he someone who can stand up to the president, to the powerful people in government, and say, look, my office is independent, and I'm doing my work independently? And certainly we do know, with the recent developments around the the Auditor General's department and Mr. Domelevo, the Auditor General, we know the extent to which, our leaders or the president for that matter can go in terms of diluting that whole provision of shall be working without the control and direction of anyone. In the case of Domelevo, we saw the extent to which the executive and the president, for that matter, went to exercise some level of control, some level of direction, even though not direction in terms of how he works, but control in terms of, go on leave, proceed on leave, and it's a directive from me, and so on and so forth. So for me, of course, I know Mr. Kissie Jabin. In fact, he's defended me in court before when I was cited for contempt, among other people, on the case involving Anas and the judges and so on. He's a fine person. I think he's a very intelligent and smart guy. But I share in the view that whether or not he is an MPP or CPP is not the matter. I don't expect the MPP at this stage to say they are nominating somebody who is from the NDC. Martin Amidu was unique in so many ways and certainly was the right person for the job. Unfortunately,
imagine you were writing a story on this nomination. What would be the headline?
Well, that's a difficult one. Perhaps I would say qualified, but with a but to it. I think on paper the experience qualified, but of course you cannot compare Kissie to Martin in terms of experience, in terms of stature. And the other important point is, what is the track record?
Okay. Now, Sule, let me ask you these three questions for quick answers in a minute or 30 seconds each. It could actually be a yes or no. Have you known Kissie Jabin to be NPP?
I don't have evidence to that effect.
You don't think he is too young?
No, I don't think so.
Do you know him to have any dealings with the Ejapa deal?
Well, I have heard, and I've heard it from not just one person. Martin, in his write-up, pointed to it. I've read a piece by Bright Simmons that also makes that allusion. And to that extent, and given the persons that are making these claims, I'm tempted to believe that he may have had a role to play either as an advisor or
Bright Simmons and Martin Amidu were categorical in tagging him with Ejapa. Did they show you any evidence?
Well,
or you don't need it?
They didn't, but perhaps we have not also requested for that. And to the extent that we have not requested and they failed to produce, I think it would be inappropriate for us to also blame them for not producing evidence, because I don't think that we are at a stage where they ought to have submitted evidence alongside the claims that they made.
Finally, the fact is that they may not have any evidence connecting him to Ejapa. Their linkage is that he is a very good friend, close friend, so to speak, of Gabi Asare-Okyere-Darko, whose firm is associated with Ejapa. Is that sufficient?
Well, I think that will not be a strong basis to make that claim and to tag him with Ejapa. But Samson, for me, the most important thing is to ask ourselves, do we have any knowledge, any experience of Mr. Kisi Ejaben being in the trenches of the anti-corruption struggles in this country? And my answer would be no. And given the situation in our country today, my desire would have been that we are having someone, even if the person doesn't have the experience, the stature of Martin Amidu. Remember, Martin has been an attorney general, deputy attorney general.
Your point is that, Sule, your point is that even for representing Anas, ensuring that Anas gets the protection and the support he needs to do the corruption things he does, it doesn't qualify him as someone who has some expertise in the area of corruption, as the law requires?
Well, in terms of the word qualify or qualification, I wouldn't take that away from him.
Okay.
But whether or not his track record in the anti-corruption struggle merits him for that position. But something finally, in relation to the Anas scenario you cite, people have also said, well, he was a lawyer for Smarties. And Smarties was the firm that was involved in the Buzz Brandon scandal. So in that context, you can say, well, in one breath, he was fighting for a journalist who was, doing anti-corruption work.
All right.
But we also have a situation where he was defending someone involved in one of the.
Thank you. Let me get to Oliver. But a bit of your last point makes me a little uncomfortable, and I'll confess this, that by representing Manasseh, I cannot be said to have some expertise in corruption. I'm not happy about that. And if I were to represent someone who is accused of murder, then I'm associated with murderers. Yes, Oliver, what do you say?
But because you said, having defended Anas in the anti-corruption struggle, we could use that as basis to say, well, he's been involved in the corruption struggle.
All right, Oliver, let's hear.
Bring that up. Others may want to look at instances where he also served as a lawyer for persons who were involved in acts of, corruption or corruption-related acts.
All right. Yes, Oliver, let's hear you.
Thank you again, Samson, for having me for this. I think, first of all, let me say that I know Mr. Kisi Ejaben to be an extremely intelligent and purpose-driven lawyer who has an acute awareness of the criminal justice system generally. I have no doubt that if he deploys that intelligence and sense of purpose, he will excel in the role if he's given the nod. He's been teaching
criminal law. He's been teaching criminal law and practicing criminal law for since 2003, correct?
Yes, yes. And I think that sort of awareness and disposition to the criminal justice system itself is something we need for a role which is about prosecution generally. And I think that he will be successful if he deploys that acute awareness and intelligence as I know him to possess. That said, I'll be failing to observe my oath of fidelity to the Constitution if I do not mention that the circumstances under which the office of the Special Prosecutor came to be given express prosecutorial powers by Parliament is unconstitutional. As one of the strongest advocates for that office, I bring this up not to be pedantic, but to warn us of something that is likely to come back and bite us in the behind. Why? Because any prosecutions secured or convictions secured by the Special Prosecutor continue to remain vulnerable by this effect. Now, in debating the suitability of Kissie Jabin for the role, I think we need to understand that this is a deeply subjective process and that people will have different feelings about whether or not a person qualifies for the role. It's not something you can check a box on. There are certain things which are objectively verifiable. Does he have 12 years at the bar? Easy to check, right? But in the subjective process, I would say we need to revert back to the needs assessment that led to the creation of the office, the purpose of the office, maybe the eligibility criteria set for the office, and also the history of the institution, as we have witnessed from Martin Amidu to this point. Now, as every public appointee, my good friend must subject himself to the regular scrutiny of the process, including specifically questions about the nature of his relationship with some of the cases investigated by the previous Special Prosecutor. I think this is not a scrutiny that he must shy away from. And we must not be quick to view this as something malicious. Surely these issues will come up when he presents before Parliament. And we have seen an appointment committee that is extremely awake to his role. Our honorable member, Honorable Sugeyini here, is here, and I'm certain that every relationship or entanglement that requires close scrutiny will be picked up by him and his colleagues. So, and in addition to that, some people believe that Martin made mistakes and that his resignation was rushed. I do not necessarily share all the sentiments expressed in that regard. However, whatever difficult views you have of the person, you cannot fail to recognize that he did make necessary the independence of the holder of the role, and he brought that up as a significant issue for public debate. So it won't be far-fetched or necessarily malicious to expect that people will be asking if Kissie has the temperament to sustain or withstand executive pressure, whether he has the temperament to keep going when the going gets tough. And I assure you, the going is going to get tough. I am certain that you come out of the process having convinced many people of his integrity and sense of purpose, obviously. However, he has to treat anybody who has a different view with respect and decorum. And the role belongs to the people of Ghana. And I think that they have a responsibility to ask these questions of anybody appointed to the role.
You don't have any issues with Inusa Fuseni, who says he's too young, and he gives you a basis that when they were setting up the law, the office, they were made to travel elsewhere to check how the office operates. And he says from everywhere they went, it has to be given to people of a certain pedigree. I'm sure you listen to him. Will Kissie Jabin not fit that,
So first of all, regarding the age issue, I think if we take it as a standalone issue, and if it is proposed as a standalone criteria, then it's surely absurd and incomprehensible in my view. But in the interest of proceeding dispassionately, I think we need to distinguish this age issue that is coming up now from the one concerning Martin Amidu. In my opinion, in that case, the challenge was specifically grounded in law and on the Constitution. Professor Kukwasari has gracefully shared with me a PC, an article he wrote for the University of Ghana Law Journal, where he lays out convincingly why he thinks the Supreme Court dropped the ball by failing to give adequate life and structure to the age regime under the Constitution in that case. Now, in this particular age discussion, I think the argument can only be sustained if a person can show somehow that it is connected to an eligibility issue which is relevant. In the example Honorable Inusa gave, I do think if it was a compelling enough point, Parliament would have found it wise to express it in the law. As far as I am concerned, the only age restriction that the person must not be less than 12 years old. This I glean from the fact that the law says you need to have
12 years at the bar.
At least 12 years.
12 years at the bar.
This means that if you become a lawyer at age 1, all you need is to wait 12 years. So from 30 years at the minimum, you're already of decent age to serve in the office. And you're giving the example of the presidency. So I think the connection between how is this relevant as regard eligibility for the role needs to be taken seriously, and that shouldn't be treated as a standalone issue.
That's the fact that he's friends with Gabi Asare-Ocheredakun, whose firm, the firm he heads, has had dealings with Ejapa, put him in any, situation to warrant the question that is coming up on Ejapa?
So, in law, generally, we treat friendship under specific circumstances differently. If it's a judge and in a matter involving a judge, we naturally expect that the judge will recuse himself from dealing with the matter in certain situations where it pertains to a case. So that has happened in law as a matter of concern generally. Now, the role of the special prosecutor is a role that has a long life. It is not only limited to a JAPA or any of the previous issues that have been dealt with by the previous prosecutor. It's something that extends beyond. And I do not think that we should be so fixated with a particular relationship with one person who a previous matter has been dealt with. But I do think that if we categorize the conversation enough to show that there's a significant risk of compromise, then we need to bring it up. If not, it becomes character assassination based on just the fact that the person is familiar with another person.
Where do you stand? Is there a significant risk? Because he's a close friend of Gabi, he has represented Gabi, recently, as people say.
Mr. Kisei Jabin is a good friend of mine. He's somebody who I've interacted with professionally and has taught me as well. If a matter concerning me comes before him, I trust that he will deal with it dispassionately. If he's friends with Gabi, I have no doubt that if issues concerning any deal Gabi or the presidency is involved in, he will deal with it dispassionately. I don't think friendship is enough to disqualify a person. No, absolutely not.
Do you know him to be MPP, and is that a ground to make him unfit for the office?
I hope he is MPP. I completely do not subscribe to this view that political affiliation disqualifies a person in any particular way. But I must say that when people talk about this, it's because they have a particular history or understanding of the way partisanship has taken hold in certain number of institutions. So even if he is MPP, the critical question is whether or not that will compromise his ability. I don't think that disqualifies him at all. So if he is, well, he is participating in the political process and the Constitution guarantees him to be.
All right. What do you say?
Samson, let me say good morning to our viewers and good morning to our colleagues online. And let me take this opportunity to also salute all workers of Ghana, today being May Day. May, the labor that we all put into the work that we do be able to provide for our needs. And
but what a day. Family. Gas is going up, fuel price is going up.
You have just taken the wind out of my sail. It's not a very good day to be celebrating workers when we are demanding of them to pay more, even though they have been on same salary for the past 2 years. But I'm sure we need to keep going as a country. Now, on the nomination of Mr. Kisei Jabin as special prosecutor, I think if you look at the law, section 13, I think, of the Act 959, the qualification seemed to be very simple, in my view. Apart from the requirement of 12 years at the bar, everything else is as if you were to run for parliament. So it is quite simple, in my view.
Can I read out the qualifications so you can?
Yes, please do.
So section 13.2, you are required to possess the relevant expertise on corruption and corruption-related matters.
Right.
Be of high moral character and proven integrity.
Right.
And finally, be a lawyer of at least 12 years standing at the bar.
Right. So you see that these other things beyond the 12 years are quite nebulous. High integrity and all that. They are quite nebulous. So I find it very easy, if you ask me, a bar to meet for one to become a special prosecutor once you are at the bar for over 12 years. But
expertise on corruption cannot be said to be nebulous. And even high moral character and proving integrity.
How do you measure that, Samson?
If you were convicted of a crime, that will take that away.
Yes, so that's why I'm saying, apart from, it's like running for office as parliament, as a parliamentarian, you know, so it fits in that one. But I'm saying that the contribution you may have done in corruption fight and all of that are that nebulous. Like we just had the example between you and Suleimana. I mean, so I think the bar is not that high. But Samson, on a more serious note, I think that the choice could have been better. If you asked me to give you a headline, if I were to do a story, that would have been my headline. The choice could have been better.
Explain.
The choice reflects the character of this NPP government, though. The impudence, the immodesty, and the indiscretions are all over this choice. You see, you are lawyers, and you always know about the spirit and letter of the law. So what is legal may not always be right.
That's right.
I mean, morally, culturally, and that is why they say justice is not just done, but it must be seen to be done.
Manifestly.
Manifestly. So it means that you must go beyond the black and white in making some of these decisions. But I'm saying that the choice could have been better, but the choice actually reflects the character of this NPP government. We have seen other NPP governments before, but this particular one, this choice reflects its character. We have seen it in the promotion of judges to the high courts. People who run for political offices, not of other political parties, of the same political party, gets promoted without a toss. I mean, we have seen it even in the choice of the EC chairpersons and the issues surrounding them. We have seen it in the removal of Dumulevo. It is the character, the impudence, the immodesty, you know, the indiscretion about the choices and the decisions that this NPP government makes is reflected in this choice. Look, even in the choice of Mr. Martin Amidu Samson, the choice was not for his flowery qualities. It was because of a perceived vendetta that he had against the NPP. And so when he got into office and decided to do better than just the vindictiveness, they were disappointed, obviously. He could not get the cooperation that he needed to perform. And I predicted that during his approval processes. Because clearly, when you look at the approach of this government to tackling our issues, it is as if a king or, a chiefdom is in charge and all others are subjects. And we must all bow and worship and just let the royals do what they please. And that is very disappointing. I think that I agree with the minority leader when he says that it is a disappointing choice and Nana Akufo-Addo will go down in history as the worst leader to have tackled corruption in this country. Already the jury is out there. You remember only recently, Professor Jimabwedi said his record has been in tatters for a very long time, and that the removal of Dumulevo actually puts the final nail on the coffin. I don't know what he will say about this choice, which I consider immodest and imprudent. And I think it could have been better, Samson.
Imagine he in fact was MPP. And so far, as I ask, I don't get any answer in the positive. Do you know, for example, those who are laying the charge of MPP, do you know that he's MPP?
Samson, again, that is an interesting, issue at stake. Mr. Martin Amidu obviously was political, but not partisan. Mr. Martin Amidu was political, but not partisan. And so that is what made his choice acceptable to many well-meaning Ghanaians at the time. Even though they knew that he was NDC by membership and by association, but they also knew that he was not driven by partisanship when it came to, doing his work.
So that should be relevant.
No. In the case of Kissi Agyabeng, he may not be political because we may not have seen him associate that politically with political parties, but he may be partisan. I don't know for sure, but the danger is if he is partisan. I recall one of the platforms that he graced after the Supreme Court ruling of the election petition in 2013. I recall the positions he adopted and the criticisms he leveled against the judges.
Platformers in the Dankwa Institute.
Yes, the Dankwa Institute platform. I recall all of that. And I wonder if that was political or partisanship. But I'm saying that the difference, it's nuance, but there's a difference. And I think we will be better served by someone who is political rather than someone who is partisan.
What you recall, he said on the Dankwa Institute platform that others have not said in criticizing the 2012 petition judgment.
Well, I mean, it was clear that the platform was designed to disagree with the ruling. And the ruling, the platform was designed by the NPP party. So it was not a civil society, forget Dankwa Institute, we know its affiliation. It was not a non-partisan civil society platform. It was an MPP platform. That was meant to disagree with the ruling because that platform believed that the ruling should have been in favor of the NPP. That platform was not to intellectually examine what may have been wrong with the ruling or judgment. It was partisan.
The Venerable Samuel Kudjeto on that platform had said that they didn't actually rule in favor of John Mahama. But Kissi Agyabeng expressed the view that he was confused as to what represented the ratio of the judgment.
I agree, but I'm saying that I recall some of the sentiments that were raised there. And I'm just talking about the difference between being political and being partisan. And I'm saying that was a partisan platform, and I don't know if that makes him partisan or not. But I am of the view that a political person taking the special prosecutor office will be better for us than a partisan person taking that position.
Okay. Now, Penka, if we may start by taking a look at this. The honorable member says that, for example, in this administration, we have seen lawyers who are MPP appointed as judges. Is that new, and what's wrong about that? What do you know?
Thank you very much.
Assist us.
I think, before I start, that's a flawed argument. That's how I want to start it. Because let me respond directly.
Let's deal with it this way.
It's a fact.
That there are people who are lawyers, who are MPP, who have become judges. What's wrong with that?
There is absolutely nothing wrong with it. I know a former MP who served in the regime of Rawlings, who is a High Court judge, an MP and a DCE. I know another former MP from Upper East who is a judge in the Court of Appeal, who was appointed under the Rawlings regime. So these arguments, we should look at merit and the integrity of the person to exercise that responsibility constitutionally, and not this issue of whether somebody is partisan or non-partisan. All of us in Ghana, in one way or the other, have sympathies for one party or the other, at one point or the other. So if you're going to look for, or saying that in appointing people to certain positions, we should appoint them because they are not members of the ruling party, that first of all will be fundamentally wrong, to argue that way. You should look at rather the history of the person and his experience and qualification, and find out whether or not the person is capable of discharging the constitutional duty that he's supposed to actually discharge. If the person is capable by qualification and experience, then all other things, unfortunately, I would say they are propaganda materials.
And by the process of appointment of judges, what's the role of the president in it?
Well, as you are very much, aware, you know, the judicial service,
Judicial Council,
the council will have to go through a system and get certain persons. If it is the High Court, as we know, they have introduced a system now. Sometimes they used to write exams. The persons who will apply will have to go through a competitive exam and go through competitive interview. And these are not conducted by politicians. Okay? They are conducted by the mandated body, by the Constitution. And they go through that process, and if they qualify, they are appointed accordingly. That is the fundamental basis for appointment.
You say the president's role is perfunctory, it's ceremonial.
Very, very ceremonial. And so when I hear my brother...
But when it comes to the superior... Okay, High Court is also superior.
It's superior,
when it comes to Court of Appeal, Supreme Court, for example, we have known of a situation where the now government, people within the now government, accused the Mahama administration of denying certain people that have been chosen by the Judicial Council the opportunity to become judges in the highest courts.
Well, it's been very interesting, and I don't want to mention names.
Because they were listed,
yes.
And then the president ignored them. And then the Ghana Bar Association actually went to court, which is Sky Dems. They put cases together, and the Supreme Court said, you know, yeah, the president is not bound by what is presented to him because it's advice, and he's not bound by the advice.
But if he is bound, then he has no discretion. If he's bound, he has no discretion.
Right.
But if he has a discretion, he has to exercise that discretion. And he doesn't owe, in certain cases, an explanation as to why. But something...
So the role is not exactly perfunctory or ceremonial?
Yes, it's not exactly that. It goes a little beyond that. Okay. But let me draw attention back to history. You see, if you look at our historical antecedent in this country, this appointment into, even though I think we are slightly deviating into something else, which I'll be coming back to the main topic. Yeah. But if you look at the historical development, there have been occasions when certain justices have served in the Court of Appeal for over 20 years and never went to the Supreme Court, in spite of their sterling performance and etc. And I recall one such example when His Excellency President Kufuor came to power was the late Justice Kwame Afre. If you recall, he was in the court of one of the most senior justices in that particular court who had written some of the best judgments. He had never, ever gone to the Supreme Court. And he got the opportunity
to serve. Promoted because...
No, I'm just coming to that. When His Excellency former President came and the Judicial Council recommended him for appointment to the Supreme Court, he did. He did. But all the years before then, he became one of the most senior at the Court of Appeal, having done so well in there. He was never ever...
What is the point?
The point I'm seeking to make is that
within the Rawlings regime, he had been nominated for appointment and he was ignored.
You see, something, what I'm trying to put across, and I want to put it across forcefully, is that our system, we may agree to pretend and bury our heads in the desert and dance to the tune of any music we provide, but our system itself creates an environment where in a regime change or the other, certain things happen. These are realities which we should not pretend.
You're right.
You know, these are realities we shouldn't pretend.
Just hold on.
I recall that one of the most senior lawyers in this country, I have so much respect for, I don't want to mention names, made allusions to the fact that there had been a particular judge whose judgments go a certain way consistently. You know, he made that allusion. So, but what I think we should be doing should be to look at the judgments of persons that we have read and find out whether they are influenced and actuated by these political, parochial appointments we so attribute them to. If they are not, but they are backed by law.
Let me get Oliver's a brief view on this point, then we'll continue with you on the special prosecutor. But elsewhere, in some jurisdictions, like in America, where they believe in the realist jurisprudence, they don't make a fuss about the fact that this is a politician. This person belongs to MPP or NDC, and judgments that they have given is influenced by where they lean. They don't make a fuss about that. Yes, Oliver, what do you say about the point he makes about even judges and how they get appointed?
So I think this is a conversation that we have been trying to have in this country, but consistently being discouraged through that language of it's not our culture and it's not a political tradition we're used to. My belief sincerely is that once we get into interrogating the leanings of how judges rule and the circumstances under which they rule, we would not only be focused on whether or not their political affiliation. We can go beyond that criteria of assessing whether or not the substantive decisions that judges and how judges rule produces bias. And I think this is where the distinction that the honorable member was making earlier about partisanship and political is necessary. I do not think political affiliation disqualifies, but I do think partisanship does. And if we allow ourselves the full process of going through reading or interrogating and carefully questioning these things, we can be able to find where the lines merge and what lines of convergence and divergence result from, and then we can say that a person is being partisan in their ruling, and this is not something which our constitution requires us of, or the societal values do not expect us to do that. But I do not think that our societal values should be expressed against political affiliations. I don't think that disables us from an enriched process and conversation.
Okay, yeah, and I must stress that you stressed partisanship as against being in a political party. Yes, so what do you say about Kissi Agyabeng and all that you have heard about him in the course of the week? What do you say?
Well, I'm not going to just rely on what I've heard about Kissi Agyabeng, but I'm also going to rely on what I know about him. This is a person I've known for 22 years in a Kwafo Hall back in those days. Okay. I recall that we're on the same floor in a Kwafo Annex B. And I recall some of his motivational messages every morning to students that he pasted on the board right in front of the hall and all that. I recall also the fact that he was very active in terms of the law and activism on campus and all that. I also recall that he excelled so much as a student of the law in his year group, coming out of the first class and all that. I recall all those things about him. And I mean, himself, the now Attorney General and others, they were mates. And you recall that we're all in the same hall. So as far as I know him, he's a very fine gentleman. There's no doubt about that. And in terms of moral character and integrity, again, as far as I know him, he stands out. You see, I am struggling very hard for the past few days to understand something. Whether it has suddenly become a curse to be young. I have struggled over the nights to understand whether suddenly it has become a curse to be young. First, when the venerable and respected Martin Amidu was appointed, you recall that there was a suit right to the Supreme Court about his age, that he was beyond a certain age, and that by being beyond 65, which the Constitution permits that when you are 60, you get 2, 2, and 1. By being beyond 65, he was not qualified to be appointed into the office of Special Prosecutor. A 42-year-old man is appointed with all the experience. We are being told he's too young. First of all, that argument about age dies immediately it is uttered. Why? Because there is an injunction by law as to the qualification criteria. If Parliament finds that particular qualification criteria to be problematic by virtue of public discourse and debate, then Parliament can amend the law. In which case, it will make certain provisions that certain category of persons are disqualified. But as we said, what is the qualification criteria for appointment to the Supreme Court of Ghana? 15 years at the bar or more, right? If you are 15 years or more at the bar, you qualify for appointment to the apex court of Ghana. Now, this gentleman we are discussing is about 17 years at the bar. He qualifies for appointment to the apex court.
Yeah, that's not the only qualification.
No, I mean moral character and integrity and all that. They are also part of what we have in Act 959.
The qualification in the Special Prosecutors Act is the qualification for a justice of the Court of Appeal.
Of course.
Yeah.
I agree with that. But as I indicated, he even qualifies for appointment to the Supreme Court by virtue of number of years he served as a lawyer. Again, in all the arguments I've heard, not one person has been able to point out any act of commission or omission on the part of Kisi Agyebeng in the course of his professional life that detract from the qualification criteria adumbrated in 959. Nobody has been able to point out that, except a few, excuse me to say, in some cases, some emotional outbursts and judgments that I find most unfortunate. You see, I see that in the near future, people are going to get a disappointment of their expectations, because this young man at his age is going to come out and prove a point that whatever they said about me, I want to let everybody know that I am not that person, and I'm going to succeed to put detractors and critics to shame.
So this may be good then?
Yes, because there seems to be so much cynicism, and people are measuring Kisi Agyebeng against the backdrop of the venerable Martin Alamisi Amidu. That is what is most unfortunate. If you do that comparison, you run into a very bizarre situation, because there are two distinct individuals. And if you're talking about clout, that he must have been that King Midas sitting up there, and every Ghanaian knows that this is a person in whom everybody is well pleased, and an anti-corruption crusader, and etc. That's the type of person we should look out for. But this person doesn't possess those qualities. Hey, you get disappointed.
But why are we, some of us, so unhappy about the criticism leveled against Agyebeng? Do you remember the criticisms that were leveled against Martin Amidu, particularly from the NDC?
They did. But that's why even the argument now...
So what is wrong with the debate?
I'm coming to that. Even the argument now, very strange. You know, I recall that there were very senior members of the NDC who had said that they had reservations about Amidu, and that he was being brought to carry out vendetta and all that. Very senior persons. Today, the same people are running an opposite commentary on the same Amidu, even though they had passed judgment on him long before he took office. So,
are you saying that when people, including in the NDC, talk about stature, using Amidu to compare with Agyebeng, they are wrong?
You see, you know why I will say to some extent they are wrong? I'll tell you that you have to judge every individual on his own merit and clout. You see, the reason is that Kisi Agyebeng is a lawyer of 17 years standing. He's a person of moral character.
Martin Amidu was a lawyer of how many years standing?
Far more than that. Far more than that. He had been Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General and all that.
So that's a fact you can't dispute.
No disputation.
And so you cannot put him in the same scale as Kisi on that score.
You see, let me also draw your attention to something. Do you know something that somebody can be 1 year at the bar and excel than somebody who is 20 years at the bar?
We go to court and defeat our seniors all the time.
So that argument is fundamentally, I have a problem with it. I have a problem with it. It doesn't necessarily mean that the longer you stay at the bar, the more knowledgeable you are. That argument doesn't hold if we go to court. But our profession is one in which we respect seniority. But in terms of this, look, let me tell you one thing. If there is any person in Ghana who has helped in the fight against corruption, if you are mentioning people, you have to mention Anas Arimi or Anas, in my opinion. If you are mentioning persons in this country who have helped to fight against corruption, Anas is one. And then Anas, in that his situation that he's going through in life to try and investigate society and bring out the ills, will opt for a particular lawyer if he doesn't know the person well. He had worked for him. And he worked for him diligently in all these matters. Take that out. He's been a lecturer since 2000 and I believe 2008. 2008 or thereabout. He started lecturing at the Faculty of Law. And then he's been practicing, he's done a lot of high-profile criminal cases and all that. That is his area of specialty. In the majority of the cases that he's actually conducted, they are criminal cases. So we have to judge him based on his professional qualification and his practice. And the fact that this is a gentleman, I don't know whether, Samson, you've had personal contacts with Kisia Jaben. He's a solid gentleman. But we are passing these judgments, and I'm getting excited because, you see, we seem to be painting a picture of gloom and doom way before the man is in office. But you may never know that this is a man who may deliver us out of that deep sarcophagus that we may find ourselves.
So your invitation to the public, those who join with, those who have expressed publicly that he doesn't measure up, he doesn't measure up, your invitation to them will be that they should read section 13, particular 13.1, and if they have anything in that regard, they should take it to the appointments committee.
That's the point.
Because you will appear to before Parliament for vetting, right? Yes. And section 13.1 says, a person is not qualified for appointment as special prosecutor if that person owes allegiance to a country other than Ghana. I'm sure that one ticked. He's qualified. Has been adjudged or otherwise declared bankrupt under any law in force in Ghana and has not been discharged. To be of unsound mind under any law in force in Ghana. Has been convicted for high crime under the Constitution or high treason or for an offense involving the security of the state, fraud, dishonesty, or moral turpitude, or for any other offense punishable by death or by a sentence of not less than 10 years, or finally, has been found by the report of a commission or committee of inquiry to be incompetent to hold public office, or is a person in respect of whom a commission or committee of inquiry has found that while being a public officer, and he's been a public officer for only about a year at the Electronics Tribunal of the NCA. While being a public officer, that person acquired assets unlawfully or defrauded the state or misused or abused the office of that person or willfully acted in a manner prejudicial to the interests of the state, and the findings have not been set aside on appeal or judicial review. So if you have any information, you should give it to...
That's the eligibility criteria. If you fall within what you have read, you are disqualified.
Okay.
If you don't, you are qualified. But you see, in conclusion on this matter, I think we should move beyond this issue of age. In fact, that one I'm emphasizing it time and again because something you are caught in it, I'm caught in it. It doesn't mean that once you reach a certain age, then you must start growing gray hair before, or you must be all white before you occupy certain positions. Otherwise, what we're going to do is that people who can do the work by virtue of age, even if that age is stipulated in the Constitution, a person qualifies by virtue of the fact that he meets the minimum, we should go for the maximum or the highest. That qualification for me will be most unfortunate and will not promote the best interest of the country.
Thank you so very much. We take a quick break, and when we return, Sir Sam Jonah has been saying a number of things. He says you in academia, we in the media, you in civil society, you have been cowed, and you are in a culture of silence. You can't speak about the ills of society and bad governance. Is that true? We'll be right back.
Ladies and gentlemen, what is baffling is that those who used to have voices on these things seem to have lost their voices. People speak on issues based on who is in power. It's our definite silence suggesting that we are no longer concerned about issues that we complained about yesterday. the molestation and in some cases assassination of journalists, murder of MPs, corruption, the harassment of agents. We have just finished another election, the 8th in the series since the beginning of our fourth republic democratic experiment. As usual, the accolades came from all over the corners of the world, and we took them with pride, as we should. But we failed to tell the world, what we failed to tell the world is that some people lost their lives in the course of the election. Ladies and gentlemen, for me, no election is as important as to warrant the loss of even one life. And the silence over it is numbing, as it gives the impression that it is okay and it is to be expected. No, it is not to be expected. It is not okay. Let me say that one of the saddest moments for me was after the State of the Nation address, when a prominent MP was asked why there had not been serious outpouring of grief about the death of the innocent people in Techiman. His response was that, as far as he was concerned, they were undeserving of any sympathy because he saw them as armed robbers. For me, that was a new low for the country. We also witnessed, arguably, the biggest assault on our democracy since the beginning of the Fourth Republic. When on the eve of the swearing in of the president, at a time when there were no ministers, and crucially, let me repeat, crucially, there was no Minister of Defense. Armed soldiers, that is to say, officers from an institution that works by command, invaded our parliament, and up to date, no serious answers have been provided. This could have been grave, this could have had grave consequences for the future of our country. Indeed, a large section of the citizenry believe that the judiciary is not impartial, with 85% of Ghanaians in a recent Afrobarometer survey perceiving the judiciary as corrupt and ineffective. My own personal experience with the judiciary is that of frustration, lengthy and costly proceedings. Some lawyers take pride in being masters of legal gymnastics. Every opportunity to delay cases are seized upon. The commercial courts, which were set up to speed up the dispensation of justice, have become a huge disappointment. Disputes involving land overwhelm the courts. Land acquisition is the most important factor, but now I will tell you, in investment decision making. Any prolonged litigation over land frustrates any investor. Indeed, it has been said that the enclave that houses the Lands Commission, Lands Evaluation, and Title Registry, these registry, is arguably the most corrupt enclave in the world. It cannot be good for investment. But corruption pervades all aspects of our governance structure. A few years ago, a prominent member of parliament said publicly that parliamentarians take bribes to pass bills that favor their sponsors. Ladies and gentlemen, if a fish comes out from water to tell us that crocodile has one eye, who are we to doubt it? Incidentally, the said MP is now the Speaker of Parliament, Honorable Alan Bagbe. Our governments, all the governments, have paid lip service to anti-corruption, but I'm afraid do very little substantially to cure the canker. Which of the major corruption issues has been conclusively dealt with since the Fourth Republic began? There have been many corruption scandals and none have been conclusively dealt with. I could give you a long list of unresolved corruption cases, but there's no need to bore you with something that we are all familiar with. As a friend of mine would say, the problem with corruption is not the absence of laws, but the certainty of punishment.
So that's Dr. Sam Jonah, and he was speaking at a Rotary Club event. And that speech he gave has become and dominated discussions. There's been some criticism, a lot of it, I must say, at him for that. Let's begin once again with Sulemana. And the aspect where he speaks about, because we cannot talk about everything else that he had to deal with, where he speaks about the culture of silence. He talks about academia, civil society, media, that there's a deafening silence and there's bad governance going on. He doesn't say it exactly that way. There's wrong going on. And the people who previously, he seems to suggest, would have been very vocal, are not?
Well, Samson, I've had the opportunity of reading the full speech by Sir Sam Jonah, and I think that we need to commend him for giving us a mirror reflection of the situation in our country today and maybe years back. Of course, people would certainly criticize him for one reason or the other, but as I've said, I think that he tried as much as possible to give us a reflection of exactly what is happening in our country. Now, on the issue of culture of silence, of course, he talks about the fact that we are gradually returning to that phenomenon, and the fact that this time it is not something that is being imposed by the military or imposed by any other conditions, but sometimes out of convenience, sometimes out of personal decisions, and sometimes, of course, the fact that speaking the truth these days gets you into a lot of trouble. It may not get you into court, but perhaps even if you were to get to court to defend yourself, sometimes it would have been an easier way than the barrage of accusations, intimidations, threats, and all of that you face, not only on social media, but even sometimes on mainstream media by sponsored agents of one political party or the other. My view is that when you take civil society, I think the country today, if anything at all in terms of our good governance, is resting on civil society. And I commend people like Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh, his colleague or our colleague, Kojo Asante at CDD, Franklin Kujo, and others who have demonstrated that goodwill, not just under this government, but previous governments. And we've had a situation where under the NDC, people like Franklin, even myself, were tagged, branded, attacked, and so on. Until date, there are people who tell me that people like you, Manasseh, Franklin, and others contributed to the downfall of the Mahama regime, to the extent that sometimes when you say something that is not going well under this regime, people will come and say, well, you called for it. This is a payback of what you advocated for, and so on and so on. They
say keep quiet and suffer.
Yes. So I think that in the area of civil society, perhaps it is not because I'm defending civil society, because I'm involved, but increasingly I have said to a lot of friends and even people in the media that it appears to me that when it comes to investigations and reporting issues of national development, civil society is perhaps assuming the role of the media in our country. And it is only when civil society bring the issues up after either investigations or reporting that the media then takes it up and then discusses it. So I think Sir Sam Jonah is right in terms of what we are witnessing in the media, the silence and lack of critical reporting in the media. Then, of course, academia, and that's another big area. When we were growing up, and even when we were in the universities, we were reading about different views and different positions, by our professors, by our lecturers, and so on and so forth. Suddenly, if you have people in academia writing, perhaps it is because their party is not in power. And if they are writing at a time when their party is in power, it's all about praises. And in fact, criticizing a government or a group that is no longer in power, that is not controlling our taxes, that is not managing our monies, that is not managing our resources. And these include professors. And then you have those who are out of power and would be commenting because they see everything wrong with the current system. And I don't want to mention names, but I believe that you know what I'm talking about. Persons who then secure positions when their party gets to power. And once their party gets to power, they are mute. Samson, it's the same thing. The same issues that our politicians, on the NPP side, my friend Alassane Suhimi and his colleagues on the minority side, a lot of the things today they would see as wrong. They were the same people who were defending the same issues when they were in government. And it's the same for the ruling party today. The things that they were criticizing and so on and so forth, today they are mute. about it. And so I think Sir Sam Jonah is right on the issue of, institutions and the media being silent. But it is not surprising.
How is he? Okay, finish that point.
It has been something that has been building up. And I think that it's almost exploded under this particular regime, where you have, the murder of a journalists who face severe threats to the point where they have to leave their country. The government prides itself, or people in government say, well, we provided police protection for the journalists. But what was the reason for the police protection? I think that is much more important than the fact that you provided police protection. I don't think that any individual's life can be protected by the mere fact that a person is following the journalist as a police officer or as a security officer. We have had a situation where the NCA has undertaken that politically motivated exercise of shutting down opposition radio stations. In other words, muting opposition voices. And if that is not an exercise, to create an atmosphere of culture of silence, I don't know what that would be. And so you talk to a lot of journalists today, and they will tell you, well, Charlie, I'm afraid. People would call you, including our parents. My mother is not illiterate, but there have been occasions where my mother will call me and say, look, you have to be careful. What we are reading, what we are hearing these days, things are not safe, and therefore you have to be careful. Look, my mother advises me on security tips. My mother, who is sitting in the village,
Sulemana, the things you say and how bluntly you put them, does it matter which regime in which you would have said them that your mother would not be concerned?
Well, I think that my mother will be concerned on the basis of what is happening in the system, what she hears on radio. A journalist has been killed. A journalist has had to leave the country. Another journalist has been arrested. Recently, a journalist working on a story about some incident involving a Council of State member, and then having arranged to meet with this person at a restaurant, the journalist is ambushed, whisked away to the police headquarters and charged with an offense of publicizing or publication of false news of a story that is yet to be published. And one wonders, how can you charge somebody for publishing false news which is yet to be published? And so on and so forth. So certainly if my mother sits in the village and hears about this, of course, she will be concerned about what I say and how I say things.
But how is Sam Jonah right, in absolute terms perhaps, when he suggests the way he puts what he says? The charge against academia. Let's take, for example, we know people like Professor Jampo. He is loud. He speaks about the issues bluntly. We all can testify to that. He's in academia. He contributes. There are other professors like him who have been talking. When the very obnoxious law bill of the Public Universities Bill was being pushed down our throats, the media almost felt this is for the universities, leave it to them. Professors Akosia Domako, Professor Etia Apieje, Professor Raymond Atuguba, they were very loud. Of course, you have professors who are clearly MPP who didn't see anything wrong with it. So academia, can you say they are not speaking? If you come to civil society, you have mentioned HKC Prempe and many okay, not too many of them. Professor Kuku Asari. You have mentioned Franklin Kujo. Look at what happened to Domelevo. What didn't civil society do? Talk about the media. What have we not done? When the cathedral matter came, I brought it up. The media full in support. If a government won't listen, what can you do? When the vote to want to do the yes vote came up, I brought it up. There was full support. It was, the president clearly found out that he didn't have support for it. So he shelved it. So what is it that is actually true about the culture of silence that he talks about?
Well, Samson, first of all, I think that even at a time when the culture of silence was something that was agreed to, that, well, we are currently in a situation of culture of silence. I don't think that meant that society, everybody was silent. I believe that there were people who were speaking up, the PAB answers, the Professor Ebibuahins, and so on and so forth.
Exactly.
And therefore, when we talk about the culture of silence, it wouldn't be absolute silence where everybody is quiet. In the context of the academia, you referenced the public universities bill. Yes, they talked about it, but it mustn't be when an issue affects you, that is when you stand up. There are other things that are going on. When the free SHS policy was introduced and was being implemented at the beginning of the first term of this government, if you followed it quite keenly, headmasters who started speaking up and raising voices and expressing concerns about certain aspects of the policy were immediately either transferred or actions taken against them. And eventually what happened was that every headmaster got muted. And it's either you keep quiet, do as we say, or you get yourself into trouble. Now, that would not mean that you wouldn't have headmasters who would voice concerns here or there. If you take the media, yes, people like Manasseh and a few other people, yourself, would continue to raise the critical issue. But it is about the price you pay when you raise those issues. It is out of those publications and those comments that our friend and brother and colleague Manasseh had to leave the country. Nobody would want to leave his own country, under such circumstances. And when you return, you have police officer protecting you. Indeed, if there was nothing, why would the government assign a police officer to protect someone? So it is the price you pay. It is the abuse that is rained on you.
All right. Okay, so I think Sweeney, you will appreciate that, because as I mentioned, academia and civil society, they express similar sentiments that we talk, but at a price.
Exactly, Samson. I think I agree with Slemana when he says that there's a need for people to be reminded of how the phrase came about, culture of silence. That phrase was not coined out of dead silence in this country. That phrase came out of criticisms of the Rawlings regime. People were still publishing the Chronicles, the Daily Mails, the opposition news outlets. It was the time that Haruna Atta and Malik Kwekubako and others were taken to prison because we had the criminal libel law then. But that was the point, that was the time the culture of silence was set to be in existence. Indeed, it was a time even demonstrations like the Kumipreku and others before them were organized. So when you speak of the return of culture of silence now, and people point to, maybe the academia in the university bill and some media houses still criticizing government, as if to say that it is evidence enough that culture of silence is not returning, then I think it is that kind of argument is based on a very myopic understanding of what culture of silence actually represents. And so it's important that, we understand how that phrase came about. And so if people who lived it are beginning to tell us about its return, we must be paying attention, even if we do not understand what it was like to live under the culture of silence then. We must take from the wisdom of those who lived it. Because you see, Sam Jonah is not the first person to have spoken of the possible return of culture of silence. You recall that even in the closure of radio stations, around that time, these discussions were had. Haruna Atta, who lived it, who paid, in some cases, what you can describe at the time as the ultimate price, going to jail, also warned and expressed concern that we seem to be going back to the culture of silence. These are people who lived it. And so when they are telling you, it is based on what they felt then and how they are feeling now. So, Samson, I'm sure we will get to that.
On the closure of the stations,
yes,
a section of you felt the media was not discussing the matter enough.
Absolutely. Something, I'm sure we'll get to that. Last week, I made reference to this, publication by the Freedom House. And I'll just, with your permission, quote my favorite part of this, article. Okay. It is actually in the introduction,
right,
where it says that in some parts of the world, the threats to press freedom are explicit and often violent. Journalists are murdered or imprisoned. States maintain strict media monopolies, and domestic audiences are cut off from foreign news sources. Such unambiguously hostile conditions typically elicit strong responses from international advocacy groups and democracies that are committed to defending freedom of expression. Now, this is the catch. However, in much broader range of countries, governments are using the more subtle tools of media regulation to restrict press freedom, maintaining a veneer of legality and pluralism that is less likely to draw attention or criticism from abroad. Manipulation of the regulatory framework allows leaders to either tolerate or rein in influential news outlets depending on the political situation, and permits even democratically elected governments to fortify themselves against future electoral competitions. So for me, when those shutdowns were happening, this kept ringing in my head. And so when I heard Haruna Atai and Co. talk about the return of culture of silence even before Sir Sam Jonah, I thought that colleagues in the media should have been more angry, should have been more vociferous in the defense of the right to continue to freely express ourselves, especially through these media platforms that were under attack. Clearly, I think that Sir Sam Jonah said nothing wrong and said nothing new, nothing that we are not all aware of. He spoke about the economy. He spoke about the debt burden that we all know about, and any businessman should be worried. Any investor looking at the debt burden, looking at, how much we are using to pay for a compensation and interest, would be worried. He spoke about gold mining, not just the devastating effects of Galamsey as a result of the bot fight against it, but also because he has managed that industry before and knows how South Africa used to earn from gold and where they are placed today, and why we should not put our hopes only in that, resource. He spoke about oil and the world moving towards green energy, and why we seem to not be having a discussion around how we possibly can replace this oil or still continue to get money when the world finally moves to green energy. He spoke about cocoa and the risk associated with it. So what exactly did he do wrong? He spoke about the judiciary, backing it with data from the recent Afrobarometer survey that shows that people do not have confidence in the judiciary. They do not think they are impartial, and they do not also think that, they think that they are corrupt, 85% of them. So what exactly did Sir Sam Jonah say wrong? What did he say in the whole presentation that anybody has been able to point out that this is wrong?
The people in the NDC are running with it and suggesting, more particularly to civil society, the religious, and the media, that when it's Akufo-Addo or NPP, you are soft, or either you are bought, But when it's NDC, and they will remind us all the time that, remember what you did to John Mahama.
Yeah.
You are not doing even a quarter of that in this regime.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Something, to some extent, I agree with it. You see, I remember when I joined politics, and I was asked why I chose the NDC. I said, after practicing as a journalist and dealing with the wrath of the NPP and the NDC, I decided to choose a political party that we all feel comfortable criticizing in this country, because I cherish the freedom of expression, because I believe it is in such dialogues and criticisms that we get better as a country. It is not appropriate for all of us to become yes men. We will become stagnant as a people when we all become yes men. So, and like I said, in the media, I faced the wrath of the NPP and I faced the wrath of the NDC, and I chose one that I thought was more accommodating of criticism, more tolerant of criticism. And I believe it is that tolerance of criticism, and that's not to say the NDC has been perfect. You still have, you know, excesses here and there. But generally speaking, I believe that the NDC tend to be more tolerant and more accommodating of dissent and criticism. And it is, I believe, the reason why the voices are at the crescendo when the NDC is in power, because people feel comfortable enough to criticize and still get a pat on the shoulder from those that they criticize.
Okay.
Unlike what happens, especially under this NPP government. And see, something I keep talking about the difference between this NPP government and the MPP governments that we have seen. This particular one, it's like none we have seen.
Okay, Panka, let me get to you, and then after that we'll get Oliver to also share his views. I was using a certain example recently that in 2016, when there was an attempt to pass what we became known as a spy bill, okay, interception of postal packets, we did representations, criticizes. There was civil society, there was the Telecoms Chamber, there was the Ghana Bar Association, and a couple others. The committee in Parliament responsible invited those of us who had written, you know, position papers to appear. I appeared with two other entities, the Telecoms Chamber and I think one other thing. We made our representations. And later, James Agaga, who was Deputy Minister of Defense, sat on this platform. Interior, sat on this platform and said, we withdrew the bill because of the representations you people made. And he particularly singled me out. Guess what? That same bill, with, if you like, no difference, was repackaged as Cybersecurity Act bill. I raised issues about the outstanding matters. The minister called me, said, you know, we'll have a meeting, we'll discuss them. It never happened. It is now law. It is in that bill, it is in that law that people who may threaten other people with,
unregistered,
you know, no, giving their, if I take your picture, nude picture, and I threaten you that if you don't give me money, I will blackmail as extortion. They can go to jail for 1 year or 3 years, and if they actually did it, they can go to jail for between 10 to 25 years. In that, the telcos, for example, one of our criticism at the point with the telcos was that they should not be burdened with doing the capability to be able to monitor the conversations. That thing is still there. A police officer can actually instruct a telco to monitor me without first going to a court. These things are still there in that law. I raised it. Nobody is interested. Do you think I will think what he says is correct or not?
First of all, let me start by saying that if you come to that conclusion, based on what he has said, you will be wrong.
Why?
That law that you talk about, which has been passed, was passed by the Parliament of Ghana, not MPP members of Parliament.
Please, this you know what you are saying. You know
it was passed by the Parliament of Ghana. Again, Samson, I don't know whether you've been able to take the Hansard to look at the contributions of the people from both sides of the House when this bill was brought to Parliament to be debated and passed into law. You know very well that laws are made in most cases to fill a lacuna which has been created as a result of practice over time. Now, if within a certain context, geography or time, you find that there's the prevalence of a certain act or a certain deed in society which is generating a lot of controversy and spreading like wildfire and destroying the fiber of society. As a responsible government, you regulate by coming out with certain laws that will regulate impunity and make sure that people are punished to serve as deterrence to those who engage in such acts. Because for me, those acts became so pronounced within a certain period, within the period 2014, 15, 16, up until now.
The point I'm making by my question is this.
Yes.
You may have heard people like Dennis Ajay,
yes,
who says this law is completely unconstitutional. The point I'm making is that when it was being brought under the NDC, there were voices against it. Did you hear any voices against it when it was being done under the NPP? That's my question.
No, but those voices...
The telecoms chamber wrote, campaigned in the media, went to Parliament to make a point. The Ghana Bar Association wrote, campaigned, but didn't make a representation in Parliament, but their views were heard. Have you heard them?
You see, that is where I wanted to even start my argument from, or my presentation this morning from. You see, there is a certain dangerous conclusion that I've heard from commentators on this issue of culture of silence. First, let me ask a fundamental question, and let's debate it from there. That what is the historical meaning of culture of silence in the context of our Ghanaian media freedom?
You're not answering my question.
I'm coming to that.
You're not answering my question.
I'm coming to that.
The same things that we were against are in this new thing. Nobody has spoken about this one.
Samson, haven't you indicated?
How do you explain that? Does it not feed into the perception that this is what is going on?
Haven't you indicated that you made effort to make an input?
I did publicly.
Haven't you indicated that?
As a Lone Ranger.
And again, did you go the next mile to ensure that when you were not given a hearing, as you have indicated, did you go the next step to ensure that you took other actions that would draw attention to it? Did you do that? And did anybody threaten you not to do it? That's the question. And those that did not make representation as they made earlier, is there any indication that they were afraid of any threat, real or imagined, on the part of anybody? That's why they didn't do it? No. There is no indication like that. Nobody has any evidence except blanket conclusions that we have run in order to actually impugn the integrity of the government without basis whatsoever.
You are saying,
I am saying this because...
You're saying by parity of reason,
yes,
that if you had an NDC government that was repeating a law that they had fought against and it withdrew it, would have been quiet again and watch it.
That I would know. That I would know. And that's why I'm saying that if you look at the argument being made, it is as though if anybody had made an advocacy for it to be dropped, etc., the person would, certain actions would be taken against the person. So let's keep quiet at the risk of and peril of our life or work. That cannot be correct. You see, we are not running a utopian society. We are running a realistic society governed by rules and regulations. But I'm beginning to realize that people think that we can have 100% perfection in all facets of life. It is impossible to have that anywhere on earth. There may be isolated cases of threats to journalists, and they will continue to be same in 100 years to come. There may be those isolated cases, but to use those isolated cases, maybe 1 or 2 out of 1,000, to run into a certain conclusion is very dangerous. Because culture of silence, I recall, growing up, that there were occasions when people were doing morning show, and right after the morning show, they were handcuffed from there. Samson, handcuffed from the morning show.
You know, I hate
police.
to do this. I hate to do this.
Hold it.
But it is important because of this example that he gave. Are you aware that a journalist has been picked up and charges filed against him because of a story he intended to do?
That's what Suleiman spoke about.
The WhatsApp story.
You see, hold on.
Please.
Hold on, my brother. Let me make my point. I am talking about the context. You have cited an isolated case, and that's why I'm saying that.
Isolated. I can give you countless number of cases.
You are talking
anyway,
about.
Sorry.
I don't do that. It confuses my thought when you do that. You see, if we are going to take a few cases and then come to certain conclusive determinations and call government names, we will also be asking ourselves certain questions. Whether we have any evidence that most of those other things that happen to these journalists are state-sponsored. Do we? And I think the answer is an emphatic no. Because the state will not sponsor people to attack, threaten, and kill a journalist and provide him with security to protect him. That would be ridiculous and ironical. So, for me, as we evolve and develop, we should take notice of the progress we are making and consolidate. Because, look, I heard him loud and clear. And it appears to me that the Venerable Sesam Jonah is using the culture of silence in a certain context other than what we know it to be. Because I rather think that there is the culture of excessive noise today. The Suhinis speak and they are free to walk around. They've never complained. My brother Suleiman Abrahima has been very critical of government in certain policies that it has brought. He's never told us, even though he said the mother was warning him, he's never told us that any time, anywhere, his life has been under threat. He's not said so. Hasn't he been speaking? Imani, haven't they been speaking? My brother Franklin Kujo and Kofi Bentel and Brad Simmons, they are all over. They have been speaking every day. They have not told us a single day that on the basis of opinion expressed yesterday or the day before, government and agencies have come after them and they are harassing them. None said so. So if a person or group of persons decide to be quiet, it does not mean that there are policies and programs in place to suppress and muscle them into silence. It doesn't mean so. So it is unfortunate that people are running into those conclusions against government. Look, one of the champions of freedom in our democracy, without dispute in our history, has been His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo. You cannot write the history of Ghana in terms of advocacy for press freedom, advocacy for return to democracy, without the mention of His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo. And it cannot be under his government that he will preside over a situation where there is deliberate state orchestration to silence the masses or the population so that whatever happens, however the ills, they can perpetuate without any check. It cannot be true. So again, Samson, why are we silent about the laws? Go and check the records in Parliament. In the Fourth Republic, laws that ensure media freedom and ensure freedom of persons to express themselves and etc. No regime has promulgated such laws than the government of Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo. No regime. The right to information, the Governance Act, special prosecutor, and many of the laws, anti-corruption laws that are there. And if you feel aggrieved by a certain conduct of government, you go for a determination in court. We are not doing that. And we are just running commentary, sometimes without any basis.
There's a section
trying to paint the government with a certain color.
Tell you that this attempt to quickly say go to court is also one of the problems. Let's go to Oliver. Oliver, so Sam Jonah, was he real? And what he said, is it your circumstance?
So something, I think I want to make, if you allow me, 4 points regarding generally this issue. First of all, I think we all need to take a breather and recognize, as some have said, that the phrase culture of silence has a loaded historical meaning in our political context. And acknowledging how that historical burden weighs on this conversation is important. Perhaps that might explain for one part the emotive reactions to that phrase. Secondly, we need to understand that a culture of silence is a maturing process and not a one-off event. It accumulates over time and perhaps becomes amplified at certain critical moments. So in discussing a particular culture, the antecedents often transcend the time spectrum within which we are looking to assess that culture. I mean, I think the language of culture itself implies that it's something systemic rather than one-off event. And so to say, where is your proof of culture, is a very difficult thing to give one-off and single-handed event examples of. Now, thirdly, the third point I want to make is that we should not fail to recognize the role that COVID-19 has played in demobilizing activism and the street-based nature of our unique protest culture. You know, so the existing public health emergency has, for right or wrong, or perhaps to some extent, been instrumentalized to de-amplify demonstration. When you take all the previous administrations under the Fourth Republic, our protest culture found its best expression when it poured out onto the street. In that regard, people's disaffection was visible and was not consigned to the silos that social media produces. So that street-based protest that we have lost is perhaps also compounded the feeling that we are not being heard when we speak. Now, finally, and perhaps the most substantive point is that we have become so, one could say that we have become so engulfed in the definitional question of what constitutes a culture of silence that we are missing the full range of concerns that some journalists raise. My sense, however, is that the problem does not arise simply because we are engaged in a definitional debate per se, but the problem is that the nature of that debate is so narrow that we are left with an impoverished appreciation of the multiple factors that form the kind of culture he was hinting at. So you could say that the impoverished nature of the debate perhaps has something to do even with the historical baggage of the word. But let me give you a reason why we should pause a little longer on the word culture in this context. And I know that this is not the first time the word culture has caused difficulties for people in this country. A couple of years ago, some feminist advocates and male allies were using the word rape culture to describe a silent pandemic that was happening in this country, and people were losing their minds over it. Your take today, when we began, you were talking about thousands of minors who are being defiled or statutorily raped, as some jurisdictions call it. So, and yet no one is talking about it sufficiently. That is what the culture implies. It's a silent pandemic which is not sufficient attention is not being given to. Now, when I hear the culture of silence in this case, I think I can pick up 4 significant but different aspects of the culture of silence which people are messing up in the debates. We have first a procedural, we have a substantive, we have sociological and recognitional. And I don't want to get academic about it, but the procedural aspects of the culture of silence, perhaps this is the part which has been the most debated, because people are expecting to see a National Liberation Council type prohibition of rumor decree or preventive detention act, or maybe the newspaper license laws of PNDC law 211. They are expecting perhaps routine abductions, torture, abuse of journalists for one reason or the other. Now, depending on what position you take, it is possible to be blind to the fact that these things could in fact be happening. Or it is possible you may recognize that, and many people, including journalists, have said that these things are happening and it's only a matter of degree. So this is perhaps, I think we need to ask ourselves here, what will Jesus do? And in my sense, Jesus will ask Thomas, come and put their finger in the wounds and see it for themselves. And let me show you how. If you take the public universities bill, which in my sense was the naked attempt to get academic freedom, so many people talked about it. Some journal made reference to the Legal Observer, for instance, which has disappeared. These are critical concerns and fear around academic freedom that was raised. The main question about that bill is, why did the government feel they need to address academic freedom within the context of the bill and try to circumscribe it? That's why you need to interrogate it. Let's take the Imposition of Restrictions Act, which many people have said makes the Prevention of Detention Act look like child's play. Let's take the Cyber Security Act, which you have talked about, which undermines legitimate privacy rights. You know, so and if you add to it those one-off instances they're referring to, Ahmed Hussein Soale's case, the incident of people who have been picked up, obviously people would begin to feel compounded that this culture is happening. Now, the second one is a substantive culture of silence. Now, I can give you 3 examples of how we are witnessing substantive culture of silence without even acknowledging it. First, to this day, we are halfway through the year. The people of San Trophy substantively deny their voice in the way our government is being run. The president hasn't addressed the issue. The Attorney General hasn't sued the EC on their behalf. The EC hasn't come back to Ghanaians to acknowledge the injustice and set out steps to rectify it. Secondly, you have expressed attempts to undermine the institutions that are supposed to check the executive in the exercise of its powers. People have talked about the circumstances in which Amigo resigned, the level resigned, and even the fact that the government deployed the military onto the floor of parliament, all because they lost the common vote for a speaker. You have the instance of the president making appointments to the Council of State in regard of the role of the parliament in the process. And within the no government at the time as well, people are even asking themselves, what is the use of speech if words have no meaning? So you can scream yourself hoarse, and the government is determined to get this way, to do so even if it means breaching the constitution. So In fact, even when Jima Boyede came out to speak, the government all but called him a senile old man. So all these situations compound a substantive feeling of silence. I can take the next one, which is the sociological aspect component of the culture of silence.
Sorry, you make a reference to Jima Boyede coming out to speak. What do you remember is what he said?
So he was talking about the credibility of the government with regard to corruption. And the reason why he was talking about it is the institutions that are supposed to check the government's attitude towards them is really the credibility of the government on that issue. So it's that attitude towards dissent and institutions that are supposed to check dissent. That's what he was referencing.
But he attacks the president more particularly that from the person he had known him up to this point, he thought that President Akufo-Addo has lost it. So is it wrong? Is it wrong for somebody else to criticize him?
I'll get to that bit. It's the technical aspects as I'm talking about, if you allow me. I think anybody that speaks up publicly understands the weight of that responsibility, and that just because you have the right to speak doesn't mean that it cannot be criticized. I mean, speaking up publicly is not a timorous adventure. However, we need to realize that the state holds disproportionate resources to overwhelm any citizen whose speech it disapproves of. It doesn't have to jail you, but there are several ways in which they can come at you, and there's evidence that the states are fairly targeted its critics. And not all of them are in the public domain. So it is a multi-sociological aspect of criticism of the culture of silence. So many times, and this is even anecdotal evidence that people give, that so many times people will call you and talk to you about a government being vindictive, or you should be careful, you're lucky you're not in the country that you're speaking this way. Things like that. You may say, but where's the proof? You're still around. But what we forget is that it creates a mounting psychological burden, and people refuse to speak up. So we fail to appreciate the sociological component of people choosing to self-censure or practicing fearsome, meaning that they have come to a point where they are feeling that Ghanaian affairs are in their fearsome, which for me is a loss to the republic. So those things that we underplay the psychological weight of them, I think creates what I'm calling this sort of psychological elements of the culture.
When people tell you that, Oliver, because you are not in Ghana, that's why you can afford to make the criticisms you make, and they say that to Professor Kweku Asare also, and they say that the two of you, more particularly, that you are able to take on the judiciary and lawyers because you don't go to court, and lawyers who go to court and are here in Ghana cannot do that. Is that relative to a particular president's regime, or that is symptomatic of our circumstance?
So I call it sociological because it's symptomatic and systemic. Now, it is not a democracy if people live in such perpetual fear of their elected and appointed representative. It doesn't add up for me that when an invitation for citizenship is extended and you accept the invitation, people are depressing you into becoming a spectator because people have, for good or bad reason, a belief that you would be in the danger of repercussions if you were in the republic. We need to interrogate why people feel that. And that feeling, it's something that we do not talk sufficiently about. So I don't think that if we want to circumscribe culture of silence within a particular political area, we are doing ourselves enough justice and dealing with the problem holistically. But we also have to acknowledge that the feeling becomes amplified in various areas depending on the way in which the government responds to it. And this is perhaps the recognitional aspect of the culture of silence I want to deal with briefly.
Okay.
So the recognitional part can be from the refusal to even acknowledge the problem, or to extend a hand to listen to why so many citizens feel this way. If the organizing logic of government is for it to listen to its citizens, then I think the government has so far failed in its responses. I mean, this is something former President Kufuor picked up on in his recent public comments when he said, we need to have a dialogue with Sam and to understand why he has that view. And this is aspects of government that has been so poorly abdicated. The government is not listening. Let me give you an example, historical example. When a lot of people point to Eduboah's speech as culture shifting in some regard, we say that he broke Ghana's culture of silence. But what we often underemphasize is the fact that the person who used the term return of the culture of silence was in fact Chairman Rawlings himself. This was 6 April 1987, when he was saying that the conduct of many high government officials vis-a-vis the public was a culture of silence. That same month, E.A. Hazel, who was the executive director of the National Commission of Democracy was saying that the NCD was going to launch a program on public education, and in his work, quote, to break the culture of silence that has struck the majority of Ghanaians. This was in 1987, way before, about a year before everybody spoke. So the government, if we have the military government itself recognizing the problem and opening the door for recognizing the problem, and I think the government needs to adopt a certain attitude about engaging people rather than feel the need, where is your proof, I need to challenge you, and have to have that reflex of, to attack, an attack reflex rather than a listening reflex. That's one of the things I would say.
Okay.
The last point about the recognitional element, sorry again for holding you.
It's okay, it's okay.
I feel like I need to talk about this.
It's all right.
Is the gendered element of the culture of silence. And a lot of women advocates have talked about how people continue to use words like ashawo and other unprintable words vis-a-vis women who have a dissenting view or elect to participate in our conversation. You have talked about consistently trying to get women onto the platform, and women not wanting to do it because of the blowbacks of it. And we do not talk about this sufficiently enough. Last year, Professor Ikea Adomagom wrote a piece where they were raising the prospect of turning culture of silence, using the Public Universities Bill as an example in that case. It didn't even make a ripple. Sam Jonas says it. We have think pieces, panel discussions. We group a panel of all men to talk about it. And then sometimes we have a sprinkling of women who are participating in some policy conversation. Right. So I think that salient angle of a gender element of the culture of silence also needs to be appreciated.
All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen. You want to make a small point? I'm coming. I'll give you just a minute or two, and then we take a break. And then, Suleimana, if you feel like you want a minute or something to make a point, just draw my attention. But let me share these views with you, and then take a break. Tony says that until we start blaming Parliament as a body for passing poor laws, members of Parliament will get off by blaming the executive and the party in power. MPs should be cited for their individual and collective action in passing bad laws. This will unite Parliament to serve as a counterbalance and check on the executive. Kweku Enchibuesiako says, my brother, there is not a single person in Ghana today who, in my view, will command a unanimous support of every Ghanaian or political persuasion for any national appointment. Not even Jesus or Muhammad will achieve consensus support across the political divide. We just have to agree to disagree and move on oftentimes. Then, to some of the messages that you have sent via Twitter. This one from Papa J Jr. He says the appointment of Kissie Jabing is just a political move. He's not coming to do anything beneficial for Ghanaians in fighting corruption, but rather to come and serve his political god. Collins Little Tete says, can he do the work? The criteria set for the office should be made clear. Any entanglement tied around Kissie Ejabing. Okay, I think I just lost that. Let me get it. It says, any entanglement tied against Kissie Ejabing. I've lost that message. I'll go look for it. Yeah, it says, any entanglement tied against Kissie Ejabing should be scrutinized to decide or not if he is eligible for the role. Big Boss says ABK Amidu should not be our yardstick in selecting the next special prosecutor because he was a monumental failure and a disappointment in that office. He spent 3.5 years issuing epistles and complaints rather than pursuing corrupt persons in Ghana. So let's look beyond him. Tanko Osman says, I don't want to mention names. Fits in the hypocrisy described by Sir Sam Jonah. Men are no more bold to call out people. Kofi Amwa says it makes sense to use Anas's men instead of his principal as promised because nothing came out of the principle that hooked Charles Bisu. But for FIFA Nyantechi mentioning his name would have also been swept away. Anas men make the money, and his principal makes the shame. I'll take this last batch of your messages on Twitter. Sita Muhammad says, apart from Woyomi, which other corruption case was successfully prosecuted by Martin Amidu prior to his appointment as special prosecutor? One can have the biggest experience of appointment, but what's the achievement? Then iFook says, the only person I want to hear on Kissie Jabin's appointment now is Anas Aremeyao Anas. Prince Henry in Koforidia says, nobody is against the qualifications of Mr. Kissie Jabin, but what we are talking about is his integrity in terms of occupying the special prosecutor's office. Looking at the role he played in defending the Ejapa deal, and that's it again. What has he done on Ejapa deal? Kissie Jabin is not on the Ejapa deal. Let's make that clear. When Amidu was the special prosecutor. Yes, it's true that Amidu in his letter suggests that there are cases in the special prosecutor's office which Kissie Jabin is involved by way of he being a lawyer for somebody. And we will know very clearly, he doesn't mention the cases, but we know that Anas's cases have gone to special prosecutor. If they go there, his lawyer will go there. But if there's any other beyond that, then maybe Martin Amidu may have us know. Okay, so we take a break here. We return. I take the small points that some of my guests want to make, and then we go into the matter of the broadcasting bill. We'll be right back. You're welcome back. This is Newsfile. It's your most authoritative news analysis platform, and here on Newsfile, we put Ghana first. Yakubu Ibn Chamba says that in this country, we have always dug our own holes and disappeared in them. It disappeared into them. We blow hot and cold on critical issues with little results. The culture of silence, as spoken out by Dr. Sam Jonah, is born out of the lack of cooperation between the academia, civil society, and the media. These are critical voices that speak out in different directions on same issues. There is a common enemy called the politics.
That I won't know. And that's why I'm saying that if you look at the argument being made, it is as though if anybody had made an advocacy for it to be dropped, etc., the person would, certain actions would be taken against the person. So let's keep quiet at the risk of and peril of our life or work. That cannot be correct. You see, we are not running a utopian society. We are running a realistic society governed by rules and regulations. But I'm beginning to realize that people think that we can have 100% perfection in all facets of life. It is impossible to have that anywhere on earth. There may be isolated cases of threats to journalists, and they will continue to be same in 100 years to come. There may be those isolated cases, but to use those isolated cases, maybe 1 or 2 out of 1,000, to run into a certain conclusion is very dangerous. Because culture of silence, I recall growing up that there were occasions when people were doing morning show, and right after the morning show, they were handcuffed from there. Samson, handcuffed from the morning show.
You know, I hate
police.
to do this. I hate to do this.
Hold it.
But it is important because of this example that he gave. Are you aware that a journalist has been picked up and charges filed against him because of a story he intended to do?
That's what Suleiman spoke about.
The WhatsApp story.
You see, hold on.
Please.
Hold on, my brother.
Charges.
Let me make my point. I am talking about the context. You have cited an isolated case, and that's why I'm saying that.
Isolated. I can
hold it.
Countless number of cases.
You are talking
anyway,
about.
Sorry.
I don't do that. It confuses my thought when you do that. You see, if we are going to take a few cases and then come to certain conclusive determinations and call government names, we will also be asking ourselves certain questions. Whether we have any evidence that most of those other things that happen to these journalists are state-sponsored. Do we? And I think the answer is an emphatic no. Because the state will not sponsor people to attack, threaten, and kill a journalist and provide him with security to protect him. That would be ridiculous. and ironical. So, for me, as we evolve and develop, we should take notice of the progress we are making and consolidate. Because, look, I heard him loud and clear, and it appears to me that the Venerable Sesam Jonah is using the culture of silence in a certain context other than what we know it to be. Because I rather think that there is the culture of excessive noise today. The Suhinis speak and they are free to walk around. They've never complained. My brother Suleiman Abrahama has been very critical of government in certain policies that it has brought. He's never told us, even though he said the mother was warning him, he's never told us that any time, anywhere, his life has been under threat. He's not said so. Hasn't he been speaking? Imani, haven't they been speaking? My brother Franklin Kujo and Kofi Bentel and Brad Simmons, they are all over. They have been speaking every day. They have not told us a single day that on the basis of opinion expressed yesterday or the day before, government and agencies have come after them and they are harassing them. None said so. So if a person or group of persons decide to be quiet, it does not mean that there are policies and programs in place to suppress and muscle them into silence. It doesn't mean so. So it is unfortunate that people are running into those conclusions against government. Look, one of the champions of freedom in our democracy, without dispute in our history, has been His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo. You cannot write the history of Ghana in terms of advocacy for press freedom, advocacy for return to democracy without the mention of His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo. And it cannot be under his government that he will preside over a situation where there is deliberate state orchestration to silence the masses or the population so that whatever happens, however the ills, they can perpetuate without any check. It cannot be true. So again, Samson, why are we silent about the laws? Go and check the records in Parliament. In the Fourth Republic, laws that ensure media freedom and ensure freedom of persons to express themselves and etc. No regime has promulgated such laws than the government of Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo. No regime. The Right to Information, the Governance Act, special prosecutor, and many of the laws, anti-corruption laws that are there. And if you feel aggrieved by a certain conduct of government, you go for a determination in court. We are not doing that. And we are just running commentary, sometimes without any basis. There's a section trying to paint the government with a certain color.
Tell you that this attempt to quickly say go to court is also one of the problems. Let's go to Oliver. Oliver, so Sam Jonah, was he real? And what he said, is it your circumstance?
So something, I think I want to make, if you allow me, 4 points regarding generally this issue. First of all, I think we all need to take a breather and recognize, as some have said, that the phrase culture of silence has a loaded historical meaning in our political context. And acknowledging how that historical burden weighs on this conversation is important. Perhaps that might explain for one party the emotive reactions to that phrase. Secondly, we need to understand that a culture of silence is a maturing process and not a one-off event. It accumulates over time and perhaps becomes amplified at certain critical moments. So in discussing a particular culture, the antecedents often transcend the time spectrum within which we are looking to assess that culture. I mean, I think the language of culture itself implies that it's something systemic rather than one-off event. And so to say, where is your proof of culture, is a very difficult thing to give one-off and single-handed event examples of. Now, thirdly, the third point I want to make is that we should not fail to recognize the role that COVID-19 has played in demobilizing activism and the street-based nature of our unique protest culture. So the existing public health emergency has, for right or wrong, or perhaps to some extent been instrumentalized to de-amplify demonstrations. When you take all the previous administrations under the Fourth Republic, our protest culture found its best expression when it poured out onto the street. In that regard, people's disaffection was visible and was not consigned to the silos that social media produces. So that street-based protest that we have lost is perhaps also compounded the feeling that we are not being heard when we speak. Now, finally, and perhaps the most substantive point is that we have become so, one could say that we have become so engulfed in the definitional question of what constitutes a culture of silence, that we are missing the full range of concerns that some journalists raise. My sense, however, is that the problem does not arise simply because we are engaged in a definitional debate per se, but the problem is that the nature of that debate is so narrow that we are left with an impoverished appreciation of the multiple factors that form the kind of culture he was hinting at. So you could say that the impoverished nature of the debate perhaps has something to do even with the historical baggage of the word. But let me give you a reason why we should pause a little longer on the word culture in this context. And I know that this is not the first time the word culture has caused difficulties for people in this country. A couple of years ago, some feminist advocates and male allies were using the word rape culture to describe a silent pandemic that was happening in this country, and people were losing their minds over it. Your take today, when we began, you were talking about thousands of minors who are being defiled or statutorily raped, as some jurisdictions call it. So, and yet no one is talking about this sufficiently. That is what the culture implies. It's a silent pandemic which is not sufficient attention is not being given to. Now, when I hear the culture of silence in this case, I think I can pick up 4 significant but different aspects of the culture of silence which people are messing up in the debates. You have first a procedural, you have a substantive, you have sociological and recognitional. And I don't want to get academic about it, but the procedural aspects of the culture of silence, perhaps this is the part which has been the most debated, because people are expecting to see a National Liberation Council type prohibition of rumor decree, or Preventive Detention Act, or maybe the newspaper license laws or PNDC law 211. They are expecting perhaps routine abductions, torture, abuse of journalists for one reason or the other. Now, depending on what position you take, it is possible to be blind to the fact that these things could in fact be happening. Or it is possible you may recognize that, and many people, including journalists, have said that these things are happening and it's only a matter of degree. So this is perhaps, I think we need to ask ourselves here, what will Jesus do? And in my sense, Jesus will ask Thomas, come and put their hands their finger in the wounds and see it for themselves. And let me show you how. If you take the public universities bill, which in my sense was the naked attempt to get academic freedom, so many people talked about it. Some journal made reference to the Legon Observer, for instance, which has disappeared. These are critical concerns and fear around academic freedom that was raised. The main question about that bill is why did the government feel they need to address academic freedom within the context of the bill and try to circumscribe it? That's why you need to interrogate it. Let's take the Imposition of Restrictions Act, which many people have said makes the Prevention of Detention Act looks like child's play. Let's take the Cybersecurity Act, which you have talked about, which undermines legitimate privacy rights. So and if you add to it those one-off instances they're referring to, Ahmed Hussein Suale's case, the incident of people who have been picked up, obviously people would begin to feel compounded that this culture is happening. Now, the second one is a substantive culture of silence. Now, I can give you 3 examples of how we are witnessing substantive culture of silence without even acknowledging it. First, to this day, we are halfway through the year. The people of Santrophi Akpafulolobi substantively deny their voice in the way our government is being run. The president hasn't addressed the issue. The Attorney General hasn't sued the EC on their behalf. The EC hasn't come back to Ghanaians to acknowledge the injustice and set out steps to rectify it. Secondly, you have expressed attempts to undermine the institutions that are supposed to check the executive in the exercise of its powers. People have talked about the circumstances in which people resigned, the level resigned, and even the fact that the government deployed the military to the floor of parliament, all because they lost the common vote for a speaker. You have the instance of the president making appointments to the Council of State in regard of the role of the parliament in the process. And within the
government at the time
as well,
no government
people are asking themselves,
government.
What is the use of speech if words have no meaning? So you can scream yourself hoarse, and the government is determined to get its way to do so even if it means breaching the constitution. So, in fact, even when Jima Boyedi came out to speak, the government all but called him a senile old man. So all these situations compound a substantive feeling of silence. I can take the next one, which is the sociological aspect component of the culture of silence.
Sorry, you make a reference to Jima Boyedi coming out to speak. What do you remember is what he said?
So he was talking about the credibility of the government with regard to corruption. And the reason why he was talking about it is the institutions that are supposed to check the government's attitude towards them is really the credibility of the government on that issue. So it's that attitude towards dissent and institutions that are supposed to check dissent. That's what he was
But he attacks the president more particularly that from the person he had known him up to this point, he thought that President Akufo-Addo has lost it. So is it wrong? Is it wrong for somebody else to criticize him?
I'll get to that bit. It's the technical aspects as I'm talking about, if you allow me. You know, I think anybody that speaks up publicly understands the weight of that responsibility, and that just because you have the right to speak doesn't mean that it cannot be criticized. I mean, speaking up publicly is not a timorous adventure. However, we need to realize that the state holds disproportionate resources to overwhelm any citizen whose speech it disapproves of. It doesn't have to jail you, but there are several ways in which it can come at you, and there's evidence that the state has unfairly targeted its critics. And not all of them are in the public domain. So it is a multi-sociological aspect of criticism of the culture of silence. You know, so many times, and this is even anecdotal evidence that people give, that so many times people will call you and talk to you about a government being vindictive, or you should be careful, you're lucky you're not in the country that you're speaking this way. Things like that. You may say, but where's the proof? You're still around. But what we forget is that it creates a mounting psychological burden, and people refuse to speak up. So we fail to appreciate the sociological component of people choosing to self-censure or practicing due fearsome, meaning that they have come to a point where they are feeling that Ghanaian affairs are in their fearsome, which for me is a loss to the Republic. So those things that we underplay the psychological weight of them, I think creates what I'm calling this sort of psychological element of the culture.
When people tell you that, Oliver, because you are not in Ghana, that's why you can afford to make the criticisms you make. And they say that to Professor Kweku Asare also. Yeah. And they say that the two of you, more particularly, that you are able to take on the judiciary and lawyers because you don't go to court. And lawyers who go to court and are here in Ghana cannot do that. Is that relative to a particular president's regime, or that is symptomatic of our circumstance?
So I call it sociological because it's symptomatic and systemic. Now, it is not a democracy if people live in such perpetual fear of their elected and appointed representative. It doesn't add up for me that when an invitation for citizenship is extended and you accept the invitation, people are depressing you into becoming a spectator because people have, for good or bad reason, a belief that you would be in the danger of repercussions if you were in the Republic. We need to interrogate why people feel that. And that feeling, it's something that we do not talk sufficiently about. So I don't think that if we want to circumscribe culture of silence within a particular political area, we are doing ourselves enough justice and dealing with the problem holistically. But we also have to acknowledge that the feeling becomes amplified in various areas depending on the way in which the government responds to it. And this is perhaps the recognitional aspect of the culture of silence I want to deal with briefly.
Okay.
So the recognitional part can be from the refusal to even acknowledge the problem, or to extend a hand to listen to why so many citizens feel this way. You know, if the organizing logic of government is for it to listen to its citizens, then I think the government has so far failed in its responses. I mean, this is something former President Akufo picked up on in his recent public comments when he said, we need to have a dialogue with Sam and to understand why he has that view. And this is the aspect of government that has been so poorly abdicated. You know, the government is not listening. Let me give you an example, historical example. When a lot of people point to Eduboah's speech as culture shifting in some regard, we say that he broke Ghana's culture of silence. But what we often underemphasize is the fact that the person who used the term return of the culture of silence was in fact Chairman Rawlings himself. This was since April 1987, when he was saying that the conduct of many high government officials vis-a-vis the public was a culture of silence. That same month, E.A. Hazel, who was the executive director of the National Commission of Democracy, was saying that the NCD was going to launch a program on public education, and in his work, quote, to break the culture of silence that has struck the majority of Ghanaians. This was in 1987, way before, about a year before Eduboah spoke. So the government, if we have the military government itself recognizing the problem and opening the door for recognizing the problem, and I think the government needs to adopt a certain attitude about engaging people rather than feel the need, where is your proof, I need to challenge you, and have to have that reflex of, you know, to attack, an attack reflex rather than a listening reflex. That's one of the things I would say.
Okay.
The last point about the recognitional element, sorry again for holding you.
It's okay, it's okay.
I feel like I need to talk about this.
It's all right.
Is the gendered element of the culture of silence. You know, and a lot of women advocates have talked about how people continue to use words like ashawo and other unprintable words vis-a-vis women who have a dissenting view or elect to participate in our conversation. You have talked about consistently trying to get women onto the platform, and women not wanting to do it because of the blowbacks of it. And we do not talk about this sufficiently enough. You know, last year, Professor and you know, wrote a piece where they raised the prospect of taking court of silence, using the Public Universities Bill as an example in that case. It didn't even make a ripple. Sam Jonas says it. We have think pieces, panel discussions. We group a panel of all men to talk about it. And then sometimes we have a sprinkling of women who are participating in some policy conversation. Right. So I think that salient angle of a gender element of the culture of silence also needs to be appreciated.
All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen. You want to make a small point? I'm coming. I'll give you just a minute or two, and then we take a break. And then, Suleimana, if you feel like you want a minute or something to make a point, just draw my attention. But let me share these views with you, and then take a break. Tony says that until we start blaming Parliament as a body for passing poor laws, members of Parliament will get off by blaming the executive and the party in power. MPs should be cited for their individual and collective action in passing bad laws. This will unite Parliament to serve as a counterbalance and check on the executive. Kweku Enchibuesiako says, my brother, there is not a single person in Ghana today who, in my view, will command a unanimous support of every Ghanaian or political persuasion for any national appointment. Not even Jesus or Muhammad will achieve consensus support across the political divide. We just have to agree to disagree and move on oftentimes. Then, to some of the messages that you have sent via Twitter. This one from Papa J Jr. He says the appointment of Kissie Jabing is just a political move. He's not coming to do anything beneficial for Ghanaians in fighting corruption, but rather to come and serve his political god. Collins Little Tete says, can he do the work? The criteria set for the office should be made clear. Any entanglement tied around Kissie Ejabing. Okay, I think I just lost that. Let me get it. It says any entanglement tied against Kissie Ejabing. I've lost that message. I'll go look for it. Yeah, it says any entanglement tied against Kissie Ejabing should be scrutinized to decide or not if he is eligible for the role. Big Boss says ABK Amidu should not be our yardstick in selecting the next special prosecutor because he was a monumental failure and a disappointment in that office. He spent 3.5 years issuing epistles and complaints rather than pursuing corrupt persons in Ghana. So let's look beyond him. Tanko Osman says, I don't want to mention names. Fit in the hypocrisy described by Sir Sam Jonah. Men are no more bold to call out people. Kofi Amwa says it makes sense to use Anas's men instead of his principal as promise because nothing came out of the principle that hooked Charles Bisu. But for FIFA Nyantechi mentioning his name would have also been swept away. Anas men make the money and his principal makes the shame. I'll take this last batch of your messages on Twitter. Sita Muhammad says apart from Woyomi, which other corruption case was successfully prosecuted by Martin Amidu prior to his appointment as special prosecutor? One can have the biggest experience of appointment, but what's the achievement? Then IFOC says The only person I want to hear on Kissie Jabin's appointment now is Anas Aremeyao Anas. Prince Henry in Koforidia says nobody is against the qualifications of Mr. Kissie Jabin, but what we are talking about is his integrity in terms of occupying the Special Prosecutor's Office. Looking at the role he played in defending the Ejapa deal, and that's it again. What has he done on Ejapa deal? Kissie Jabin is not on the Ejapa deal. Let's make that clear. When Amidu was the Special Prosecutor. Yes, it's true that Amidu in his letter suggests that there are cases in the Special Prosecutor's Office which Kissie Jabin is involved by way of he being a lawyer for somebody. And we will note very clearly, he doesn't mention the cases, but we know that Anas's cases have gone to Special Prosecutor. If they go there, his lawyer will go there. But if there's any other beyond that, then maybe Martin Amidu may have us know. Okay, so we take a break here. We'll return. I take the small points that some of my guests want to make, and then we go into the matter of the broadcasting bill. We'll be right back. You're welcome back. This is Newsfile. It's your most authoritative news analysis platform, and here on Newsfile, we put Ghana first. Yakubu Ibn Chamba says that in this country, we have always dug our own holes and disappeared in them. Disappeared into them. We blow hot and cold on critical issues with little results. The culture of silence, as spoken out by Dr. Sam Jonah, is born out of the lack of cooperation between the academia, civil society, and the media. These are critical voices that speak out in different directions on same issues. There is a common enemy called the politician that should be dealt with. Thank you. So Yakubu Ibn Chambers sending that from Accra. And then Nana Otio says that the culture of silence Edubuahin referred to is referred to in 1987 is miles apart from what Sam Jonah is talking about. The two are not the same. Oliver helped us with that history properly. Yes, Sule.
Well, Samson, just a quick one.
Yes.
I think my brother Kwenka makes the point that yes, I've been quite critical of government and nobody has threatened me or haven't come out to say somebody has threatened me. But the reality is that, Samson, yes, I've been critical of government and that is my role. In fact, the president tells us to be citizens, not spectators. And I believe that when I was doing the same thing about 4 or so years ago, he was enjoying it because he was on the other side. Because the reality is that I was much more critical of even the Mahama administration than I have been over the last 4 years. And yet, in terms of the abuse, in terms of, people calling you to say, my brother, you have to be careful, and so on and so forth, it is more manifest, it is more consistent now. I only used my mother as an example because, as I said, this is an old lady sitting in the village and so on and so forth. He also talked about the fact that the incidents have been quite isolated. Yes, if you look at it holistically, you may say so. But if within a period of 4 years, we have had a case of a journalist having been shot, swallowed, till date, no proper investigations done, nobody has been punished for it. We have the incident of Adeti, after he reported on a matter that led to the resignation of the then Minister of State, Roxanne Bukari, and Adeti had to leave Bolga to seek refuge in Accra, goes back and his house is broken into and raided. We have a situation where national security storm a media organization, Modern Ghana, to arrest journalists, blindfold them, take them over to the national security premises, seize their equipment, and my information is that till date, even some of the equipment still are in the possession of the police. We have a case where, the police would ambush a journalist, take him to the police headquarters for a story that he hasn't yet been published because the story is about a powerful person in society. We have a situation where radio stations have been selectively closed down and so on and so forth. And even when you go to academic institutions, if you have friends there, they will tell you about the prevailing environment where people are not free to speak their mind because whether you get promoted, whether you get appointed, and so on and so forth, can be affected. I think that we need to accept the reality. Nobody is saying that these are government-sponsored. Nobody is saying that President Akufo-Addo has directed, state agencies to perpetrate this.
But Sulemana, you had said, and publicly, that there was a certain amount of money that was being channeled into the budget, and it was meant for political party communicators in the name of whatever it was. Not so. So why are you surprised then if what you said was true?
Well, I think that therefore we should all agree. We should all admit that this is the situation. I think that my brother Penka and others who are affiliated with the party in power now, we will do ourselves good if certain things are not going well. For all you know, my brother Penka will not do these kinds of things. There are people who will be doing it in the name of supporting the party just to seek favors, in the name of singing and hero worshiping and so on and so forth. It is only when we accept the situation as real that we can tackle it. But if we begin to feign, ignorance is not true, it's not this, when people are suffering, at the end of the day, I don't think that we will build a country in the way and manner that we all want to see.
Thank you, Sule. Yes,
I think that I'll also be very brief because almost all the points I sought to make in my comeback, especially after my brother Pemka referred to the fact that what was happening was not state-sponsored, were beautifully highlighted by Oliver. And the few gaps have also been provided by Suleimana with examples of some of these things that actually involve state agencies. And so it makes you wonder what he means by it not being state-sponsored. When you have the national security involved, when you have the police institutions involved, who all work up to, the government appointees, in this case, the ministers and all of that. Then one little, addition I want to make to Oliver's contribution when he talked about the gendered part of this argument. I wrote down to speak of the procedural and substantive, but the gendered part, I agree with him. But I also think that it should be the slandered, because that's also what is very obvious in the discussion of culture of silence. You have a situation where when people speak out, like say Sam Jonah has spoken out, there seems to be a grand scheme to slander, to just ridicule, to discredit, if I'll put it that way, the speakers of what is seen to be uncomfortable, to the government. There is a deliberate scheme to either slander or ridicule them, to discredit them. Imani has suffered it. The Kofi Bentil and others have suffered it.
Is that new?
It is the gravity. It is the manner in which it is done, and the rate at which you are seeing it. I mean, like I said in my first submission, that the NDC is not with angels. It's not with people who are all tolerant of dissent. But largely, I have made the point that they are better. Right. Now, my brother speaks about Nanado's record when it comes to, expansions of the freedoms
legislation
of the press and all of that. I agree with him. But you see, that is why it is very sad that as president, he's ending that record in such an anticlimax manner.
Okay.
It is sad that as president, he is going down in history as one that has, limited our freedoms of expression, the most under the Fourth Republic.
All right, now let's get to see, once again, unfortunately, like it happened last week, we have just some 20 minutes to deal with the the broadcasting bill. But Big Boss says, for heaven's sake, another journalist, the late Abanga, was killed in 2015 in the BA region while carrying out investigations on government officials and their corrupt activities. Nothing has been. Are you sure about this in facts? Well, okay. Then this one says culture of silence. Well, the truth of the matter wasn't technically okay. Your message is almost unreadable. Then Fanti Boy said, to occupy the special prosecutor role to benefit Ghana, you need big balls. And then the nominee too is, I can't say that again. Thank you. And the final one from Alakatara San says, Martin Amidu was just a talkative and didn't act accordingly as special prosecutor, so he shouldn't discredit Kissie Jabin's competence. He's a total failure. Right. So we are back to the broadcasting bill that the state intends to bring in. But before that, this show is brought to you by Bank of Africa, strong as a group and close as a partner. MTN, everywhere you go. Ashesi University, educating ethical and entrepreneurial leaders for Africa. Waylead Properties, home is where you start. Having mosquito spray and coil, pleasant on humans, tough nightmare on insects. And Napa Foods, it is tasty. DBS Industries, we truly are your roof experts. Robert & Sons Limited, optical services, your comprehensive eye care services provider. So I may start with you, Oliver. When you hear that, because of what we are seeing within the media, the airwaves and so on, we need a broadcasting bill to sanitize the system. Do you think there should be any fears when we hear anything like that?
Sometimes I'm very apprehensive about the broadcast bill, and I sort of was wondering whether you should call on me first to talk about this, since I'm going to have a very critical take on this. But I actually want to start first with the whole conversation, which needs to ground up the way we discuss the law. I mean, obviously, everybody wants to start from Article 162, which is that there should be no law requiring any person to obtain a license as a prerequisite to the establishment or operation of a newspaper, journal, or other media for mass communication or information. Now, as soon as you mention this, people automatically run to Article 164 to say that, but it is not an absolute right. But who said anything about absoluteness? I think one of the tragedies of how we analyze rights in this country is that we tend to read the right backwards. That is, we start from the limitation. So even before we give ourselves time to fully appreciate the breadth of the right and the scope, people are already invoking the limitation to negate the right. My suggestion is that we spend a little more time with the right to fully appreciate, again, its scope, its history, and its purpose. Because if you do that, you give yourself a more broader view to understand how you can narrowly constitute and understand limitations to right. Now, let us not forget that in this country, power has been more frequently abused as opposed to rights. And yet, those who call on power to account and those who are calling for rights to be respected are often those who are more opposed when they speak up. And that's the thing. The tragedy of democracy, you say, is that it wipes up the memory of the past from our collective memories, and the evils that we attempt to guard against become decontextualized. We forget the reason why this particular provision was put in it for the first place. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, why is this bill bringing back authorization at this particular time? And I'm sure there are certain things about the bill that is useful. Like, for instance, the need to clarify and define the roles of the two regulatory bodies of the sector, the National Media Commission and the National Communications Authority. But I think this is where the law should have ended. Because so many of the things contained in the law read like a playlist from the horrible 80s and 70s and 80s. There are so many things in the law that look so innocuous on their face that have been used previously. We use the same language and the same paternalistic logic to depress rights in the country. For instance, the memorandum to the bill says the international best practice of using program content as a key criteria for the authorization and regulation of broadcasting services in the public interest is absent from our current legislation. And I'm wondering this is exactly what the Constitution is preventing us from do, that we do not license or authorize on the basis of program content, because it's a shortcut to censor and oppress. Our constitution speaks exactly and specifically to our history. We cannot pick examples from the US, UK, and others which do not have that historical and political context in the country. The bill is also talking about the need to use the media space to instill a sense of patriotism. And I'm wondering, wait, what? Let me give you an example of how the language of patriotism has gone wrong in the past.
Oliver, before I also forget, the point you make about, licensing content, which is a danger. Can't we say our Supreme Court is up to the task? When we brought regulations, the NMC's regulations that were intended to regulate content, the Supreme Court didn't blink in striking the provisions down as unconstitutional.
Absolutely. It then brings into question, why are we then coming back again on something which we have specific judicial attitude against, and then bringing it back in another bill again? This is where the confusion lies for me, in the way in which judges may react to it in a particular way, and then we bring it back in the law. And the problem it creates is that you cannot specifically and every day be going to court. It sucks the energy out of the people who want to do work in the space. And that is the danger a law like this creates and continues to perpetuate.
Okay, proceed to the aspect of the patriotism thing you spoke about.
So the patriotism, I was wondering again in the past, within the specific context of media, how patriotism has been used before. So in 1993, Joyce Ayer, the Minister of Information then, gave a speech where she said that the role of the media is to conscientize people because we have an illiteracy problem. On the face, it seemed harmless. Yet that conscientization effort became why private newspapers were banned because they were distorting news, for being unpatriotic. A lot of newspapers were banned because we accused them of subversiveness and treason, and that is unpatriotic. Now, we also banned foreign content. Again, it is in this same law during that era because it was cultural imperialism. So this history of how innocuous words, which seem fine, of course, everybody wants to be patriotic. When you bring it within the media context and charging and putting it as a duty of assessing program content, then you're going to run back into the same problems you're trying to get away with. That's one of my concerns.
But in the
law itself, right?
Yeah, but in the law itself, this aspect you talk about, is it not circumscribed? Is it general? Is it not circumscribed to the community radio that is supposed to ensure a certain amount of preaching patriotism? And do you agree or you don't agree that we are losing our identity and culture, and something has to be done about that?
I think that the way in which we deal with, if we have a genuine concerns about culture being lost, is that we have a state which is sponsoring people to go to Israel. We have a state that is building a national cathedral. If it's concerned about culture, it puts in place programs that support that culture in an open and liberal space. You don't legislate it and become a basis for unlicensing or refusing to give people the right to speak. That's where I think the responses or the devices which we want to address problems sometimes become problematic. You know, when I pick up the law, the bill, and the memorandum to it, it says we have over 300 radio broadcasting frequency authorizations across the country. And this is radical, imbalanced, haphazard. These were words specifically used by the memorandum. And I'm saying, when I look at the Constitution, it was a situation where we have over 5,000 channels, 50,000 newspapers, because it wants that plurality of voices, that people can choose what kind of content best sits with them. And let's not forget that the fact that there are 50,000 channels necessarily doesn't mean that it is problematic. We have already have significant instances in the law which allows for how we deal with undesirable speech. And I'll get to that if we do have time. But I think the bigger problem I have with the law, and I'll give two examples, is the confusion between what is desirable and what is legal. So the rights of speech and media rights exist specifically to produce or to protect undesirable content. If that wasn't the case, then there would be no reason for encasing the right in the Constitution at all. Because that is precisely why we have it. And so I think that when we are coming into this conversation, we should be very careful that specific feelings about content should not be used as a basis to declare legality or illegality.
All right.
Secondly, the law says, uses that we shouldn't give the bill, sorry, I shouldn't be saying law. The bill says you shouldn't give political parties, religious bodies, the authorization.
Politically exposed persons.
Authorization. And first of all, I do not see how this does not create a licensing regime. Secondly, I was looking at the restriction of religious bodies. And it's a clause for me that doesn't make sense or even take into account our history. In 1984, John Kubler, who was editor of the Free Press, after 1 year of being under detention without trial, was released and died. No newspaper in the country talked about it. It was only the Catholic Standard that published it. What did it result? Soldiers went ahead and were looking for the editor of the Standard then, Reverend Palmer. And that later on it emerged that soldiers had picked up a different priest and that he had been found dead somewhere around the Choco Beach. Nobody published it. It was only later that we found it. So sometimes even the religious organizations have been the voices that protect rights in this country and be able to report injustices. And to attack them doesn't make any sense in my perspective. Okay.
Just a minute in that area also. We have heard in this country terms used as media tyranny. So what is meant by media tyranny is that there is one media conglomerate. You have stations all across the country. In this bill, you can have only 3. You can have, say, in Accra, Kumasi, and another place. End of story. You can't have 2 in Accra. Is that a problem?
So for me, the bill was proposed, again, this bill we're talking about, let's put it in context, dates back to 2014, when Mahama Yeriga was Minister of Information. Now, even before that, there's it started from 2010. Now, we have a government that expressly says, I am for private capital expression. And my sense is that, well, it will be very difficult if they propose the bill around the same terms and whether it will pass muster. But generally, the question about the role of money in speech is a problem across the world generally, and it's being consistently talked about. So I think that if you're using trade, even when you're using trade as an example, it becomes a constitutional question as to how did you settle on 3? You know, if you want to break up a conglomerate or prevent monopolistic attitudes, examples exist in the telecommunications culture already under our laws, which we have seen the National Communications Authority use in the context of MTN to try to break up monopoly in the space. So we can think more innovatively rather than making it a count of numbers in dealing with something which globally everybody is talking about.
All right. Thank you so very much, Oliver. You can take leave of us at this point. Thank you so very much for your researched views that you share. Sulemana, we are in trouble again. We have just 10 minutes to go on this subject. Let me have you speak in 3 minutes. What should we be paying attention to in the broadcast bill?
Well, Samson, I think at this stage, it's important to make the point that what we have is a draft bill.
That's right.
Stakeholders have been invited to make comments and inputs. I have seen that Giba, for example, has made a very elaborate contribution in terms of what they expect to see in the bill ultimately. Now, in terms of whether or not we need to have regulation in the broadcast sector, I think there's no doubt that we need that. What is important is to look at what kind of law do we need? What should be the content of that kind of law? Because if we talk about all the freedoms that are guaranteed and granted within the Constitution, the same Constitution also talks about the fact that we need to make reasonable legislation to ensure that public order, public morality, the rights of other persons are respected. And in terms of the debate around whether or not to have regulation in the broadcast space, way back 27 years ago, it was something that was put on the table. And the conclusion was that indeed the National Media Commission and Parliament had a responsibility to ensure that we do have a piece of legislation that will regulate the broadcast sector. Now, finally, to talk about the Supreme Court decision on LI 2224, because I think that was a very important decision that will guide us going forward. And even as the Supreme Court said, well, the actions intended within the law constitute an infringement of the Constitution, and therefore the law should be taken down or struck down. The same Supreme Court then makes some guidance, offers some guidance to the National Media Commission. And if you, just within some 30 seconds, it says, for example, the commission, and this is part of the ruling, it says the commission, referring to the NMC, could have achieved the results of what it sought to achieve with LI 2224 without a restraint on press freedom if Parliament had published detailed legislation on content and imposed sanctions for infringement, which they could do under Article 164. The same judgment, the court says the NMC, even though the NMC's function does not include what it intends to do under LI 2224, what the NMC could do is to publish guidelines to regulate the future conduct of the industry players and to possibly sanction infractions of the regulations. And so I think essentially it is about what kind of law we would have, rather than whether or not we should have a law.
All right.
As far as the law, I think it's a certainty that we must have, because otherwise the absence of law itself or the absence of regulation in itself could be what would undermine and undo the media industry in the country.
All right, Sulemana, thank you so very much. Definitely when the final bill is ready, we will have another discussion on this subject, correct?
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sulemana. Now, yes,
well,
Sweeney, if you can also do 2 minutes and he takes the rest of the 2 minutes.
All right, well, since we don't have time, I think I will spend my time looking at the processes that are required before it even passes into law. And it's especially important because of a texter earlier who made the point that Ghana would be better if Parliament passed good laws.
Right.
I think that there's a misunderstanding of the role of Parliament in our whole governance architecture. By the kind of system we operate, Parliament does not have the power to initiate laws. Until recently, when the Speaker of Parliament, helped to draft a private members bill guideline that is now supposed to be used. But even that, there are limitations, even within that. And it's also because of the nature of our 1992 Constitution. So clearly, whether a bill gets passed into law or not is the responsibility of the executive in this country.
Right.
That is the structure that we have. So if you want a law that doesn't get passed, it becomes unacceptable to blame Parliament, especially when that law has not been introduced in Parliament by the executive. Okay. Because everything that gets passed into law has to be sponsored by the executive. So this bill was first considered, like you said, around 2010. We had the 2012 draft. This is the 2014 draft. That 2014 draft made it to Parliament, but never got passed. And then what also happens is that when a bill is introduced in a session and it doesn't get passed, you don't roll it over to the next session. So it will have to go through the process of going back to cabinet and maybe some more stakeholder considerations before it is reintroduced. So I think that since 2014, we have not reintroduced this bill. And so this bill has not come to Parliament again. And so it is important that the Ministers of Information and Communication begin to work on this 2014 draft bill, engage stakeholders more, especially in the light of the new rulings that have come up as a result of the considerations that were to make the NMC and NCA work better. And I'm sure that if they are, if they make it a priority, they can get it passed in this Parliament. And it should pass because we all need it.
It does appear that more people, many people, particularly in the media, are more favorable to the bill to the extent that it is going to give a lot more teeth or power to the NMC rather than the NCA.
Well, thank you very much, but unfortunately, we don't have the time. And I know that my colleagues just had to.
So when the draft bill is finalized, it's ready, we will have a whole show to discuss it.
I agree with you, because otherwise we don't have the time at all. Just in 1 minute, what I will say is that we've all agreed that there are processes it has to go through before it is passed. We're going to have public fora. and then we're going to have memoranda submitted by different groups and interest areas and all that, and we'll have very healthy debates. Then after which the draft is presented to Parliament itself, and as it goes through the first reading, the second reading, the consideration stage, and it goes through third reading and all that, Parliament will do a very good job. I don't have any doubt about that. So that at the end we'll have a law that will stand the test of time. And remember that your panelists who have just gone on Zoom, I mean, are all unanimous on the fact that there's a need for it. But the nature informed.
They are not.
The nature informed. Oliver has reservations, but I don't think he's against it.
I think he has reservations with the provisions in the
certain
draft
provisions
bill.
in the draft bill. And he even corrected himself along the line. Yeah. He was speaking as though it was law. But later on he said that no, it's a bill. And that is why these ills he finds there, society, we can all contribute to ensure that they are corrected, and then we have a better law in the system.
What is important, maybe if you permit me, is for us to have this law so that that arbitrariness in the way we even shut down or allow radio stations or media houses to appropriate will be streamlined.
All right, thank you very much. A very final message. YK Ansayabua says that Sam Jonah inherently has played an integral part in the bad governance he is moaning about now, and benefited from everything wrong with our system getting worse, and the culture of silence is mere hypocrisy. I was harassed on Facebook by NDC Kubolos during Mohammed's time, but I chased them. I have had MPP folks unfriend me and stopped talking to me for speaking up against the bad governance going on now. I think we need to cure ourselves of hypocrisy and have those who claimed that they stood for Ghana first under the NDC regime keep doing the same things under the NPP regime. And this is where we draw the curtains on the show today. My guests have been Oliver Barker-Vormawor, who is researcher, University of Cambridge, Faculty of Law; Suleiman Ibrahima, Executive Director, Media Foundation for West Africa; Joseph Dindiok Kwenka is former MP, former Deputy Attorney General and Minister for Justice; Alhassan S. Suhini is MP, Tamale North, and Member, Appointments Committee of Parliament. I'm Samson Ladia Yanini. Have a good afternoon. God willing, we'll see you next week with another edition.